Good morning, everybody. I appreciate everyone coming down, weathering the weather and getting down to South Padre. I hear there's been some interesting travel stories, but glad you all are here at the GSMFC 69th annual meeting, and welcome to sunny and beautiful South Padre. Oh, wait a second, maybe not quite so sunny, but hopefully the weather will improve as the week goes on. So over the past several years, the Commission has held various general sessions on a variety of different topics: economics, mercury, ROV, monitoring, HABs, oysters, recreational fishing, and actually our last one was on turtles, but it was freshwater, of the freshwater variety, diamondback terrapins. So this one we're going to the marine side, and we're going to talk about the current science and status of Kemp's Ridleys. We've got a number of presentations, and should be a very educational and informative session. I will turn it over now to Jeff Rester, who is going to facilitate the session. And again, I appreciate y'all coming, and enjoy the session.
Again, I appreciate everybody coming out today. We have 6 speakers here in person, and also one that's going to be online here shortly from Colorado. We're going to discuss a variety of topics. We're going to get a broad overview of Kemp's Ridley turtles, and then we're going to work our way through nesting females, through juvenile dispersal, through adult habitat use, and then also some questions we have about the current status of the Kemp's Ridley turtle in the stocks. But first speaker is going to be Jaime Pena. He works down at the Gladys Porter Zoo. He's been working with Kemp's Ridley for a number of years, and he is going to give us an overview of the Kemp's Ridley turtle and where we're at. So, for you.
I'll put this on already because I'm walking around.
Do you want to?
You know what? I don't need it because I can. Dave,
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
There you go.
Just kind of speak toward that thing.
Yeah, no problem. I can see it. I'm too short. Dang it. All right, well. I guess I'll suppose I have to remember what this presentation is about. Good morning, and thank you for coming. Thank you to the Commission for having us. Jeff, Dave, thank you very much for once again giving us the opportunity to present our work with the Kemp's Ridley sea turtle. Where do I point there?
There you go.
There you go. Let's see. And my talk is called the 71-year and counting history of conservation of the Kemp's Ridley sea turtle. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Luis Jaime Pena. I am the curator of conservation for the Gladys Porter Zoo in Brownsville, Texas. And I've been involved in some way or shape or form with the Kemp's Ridley project for 25 years now. My contact information is right there. Let's see. The Kemp's Ridley sea turtle is the smallest of all sea turtles, and it is one of the most critically endangered species as well. It is the only species of sea turtle that routinely nests during the day, and it's called the Tortuga lora in Spanish due to its beak, the shape of a parrot's beak. It is endemic to the Gulf of Mexico, and it was actually designated as the official state sea turtle of Texas in 2013. It has received continuous attention on the part of the Mexican government since 1966, when that country's National Sea Turtle Conservation Program began. But the seeds for that program and for Kemp's Ridley conservation actually began almost 20 years before. with this man, Andres Herrera. Many of you know about the famous Herrera film, so I'll just be quiet and let you enjoy this clip from that 18 millimeter film in 1947. This is June 15. It was a Wednesday. And Mr. Herrera was just a self-made man that really liked conservation, even before it became a buzzword. And so he filmed this, and at first the scientific community thought that this was 40,000 turtles in one day. Recent research by Dr. Weevils actually tells us that it was more around 27,000 for that day, and we calculated an estimated 125,500 nests for that year, which more or less equates to 50,000 nesting females. Please remember that number, 121,500 nests in 1947. Now, this is a conservative estimate for that year. This film, the original of this film, by the way, is now at the Archicard Institute. We were very fortunate to have the original film donated to us by the Herrera family in 2014. And me and Dr. Wibbles presented the film at the Archicard Institute, and it's right there archived. Now I'm going to go over a little bit of the history, decade by decade. In the 1950s, there was a lot of turtles, and there was a lot of take on the turtles for sustenance. You know, let's go get some eggs, get some bread done, eat it. It wasn't a lot of commercial take. That came a little further into the decade when the take for sustenance became commercial take. So truckloads and truckloads of eggs were taken from Rancho Nuevo to Mexico City, for example. Now, the turtle itself wasn't killed for its meat because it tastes very bad, according to the people who have actually tasted the turtle. So that wasn't the problem. The problem was that they didn't let any recruitment happen. They just took all the eggs. Also in the 1950s, the pink gold rush, which the New York Times called it, it was as bad as the Klondike gold rush of 1892. There was a lot of shrimping back in the 50s, a lot of shrimping. I don't have to tell you what effect that has on sea turtles, especially the Kemp. A little bit of good news in the 1960s, when 14 years after the Herrera film, the scientific community finally saw the film thanks to Dr. Henry Hildebrand. And after seeing the film, a couple of concerned people like Durrell and Ethel Adams started to work towards conservation of the species. And as a matter of fact, you could consider Durrell's conservation work the first conservation effort for the Kemp Ridley sea turtle in 1963. They did it together with Isla Lecher, which is very famous in this part, Zapata Island, Turtle Lady, and with their good friend Antonio Gonzalez from Rancho Nuevo. I was very lucky to know everybody in that picture except for Durrell Adams. So, and as mentioned, the Mexican government began their work with their National Sea Turtle Program, with Humberto Chavez, Martin Contreras, and Eduardo Hernandez, who opened up the first sea turtle camp in Mexico in Rancho Nuevo on April 15 of 1966. This is the turtle camp back then. And it was north of where the current location is right now, 5 kilometers. In the 1960s as well, the Marines are not protecting the sea turtles. The Marines are protecting the biologists, because the biologists got there and basically are telling the people, we're here to protect the sea turtles. Don't take the eggs. They didn't like it. So they call in the Marines, and there they are. You shouldn't do that if you're in an arribada, okay? Please don't. But also notice how they're clumping together for further reference, for future reference. So in the 1960s, 70s, it was a little quiet for the Kemp Ridley project, as opposed to everywhere else, I suppose. The people were adapting, the Rancho Nuevo people were adapting to the presence of the biologists and the Marines. The biologists were learning a lot about the biology of the species and the management of their nests. A lot of mistakes were made in the beginning, of course, but little by little they started learning how to properly manage the nests. Also in the 1970s, a couple of American citizens were visiting the turtle camps. Dr. Peter Preacher and Dr. Patrick Birchfield, 1972. As the decade was winding to an end, 1978, both countries decided that it's time to get together and work together in order to save the species. And so it was born the Kemp Ridley Sea Turtle Restoration and Enhancement Program. That's the official original title for the Kemp Ridley project. That's how we call it. Except Charles. Charles really always calls it the Kemp Ridley Sea Turtle and Restoration and Enhancement Program. Good, Charles. We need to do that. Yes. It is one of the longest running conservation efforts in the world. And then in 1981, the Fish and Wildlife Service, for logistic reasons, asked the Gladys Porterfield to take over for the administration of the U.S. portion of this binational program. That's a picture of the kitchen at Rancho Nuevo in 1978. And one of the first patrol vehicles, not very efficient, but hey, look cool, I guess. And then 1985 happens, and only 702 nests are registered. Now, if there was 121,500 nests in 1947, that means that there was a decline of a little over 99% on the number of nests. So that was really, really bad, because that's not even 300 nesting females in the whole year. So there was talk of giving up in the project, that's it, game over, pack it up. But the project persisted, and there was a couple of things that happened in the U.S. and Mexico. The Kemp Ridley actually became the emblematic species for TED regulations in the United States, and Mexico established a total ban on sea turtles and their products in 1990. And rather than give up, the project actually expanded first to the first to the south in 1989, and then to the north in 1990, and further expansion happened in 1996 towards La Pesca, Altamira, and Miramar. So now we have 6 turtle camps in Tamaulipas. There's a couple of pictures from some of them. And just to give you an idea, that's where the Gladys Porter Zoo is. This is basically, the project covers half of the state of Tamaulipas, which is the epicenter of nesting for the species. Patrolling these 6 turtle camps is the equivalent of going around the world 6 times in 6 months. It's a little over 150,000 miles that are traveled. So just you guys do the math and see how much fuel that is and how much the ATVs are used. So it was a pretty good 13 years. Very, very good. It just kept going up. And we were becoming a prime example of how the effective implementation of a conservation project can save a species from extinction. It was like, wow, we're pretty cool. We're saving the turtle. And we thought there's so many turtles that now they're arriving at night to nest, and you never see Kemp Ridley turtles at night, and there they are. There's about 400 turtles one night there. That's in the early 2000s. The corrals were expanding like crazy. This is a main corral at Rancho Nuevo. We actually had to put auxiliary corrals to the south side of the beach and the north side of the beach. So many nests. That's actually Thane right there, by the way. And of course, the arribadas started happening in the thousands of turtles, not hundreds. I worked there in the mid-90s, and if we had 300 turtles, we would go crazy. Oh my God, we had a huge arribada. And now everybody laughs at me when I tell them that, because 300. We had 2,000 the other day. So it was so cool that, the experts got together. I'm not a member of that expert working group, by the way. I'm a consultant. And the experts decided that, hey, it's going so well that we're going to downlist the species from endangered to threatened by 2011, and we're probably going to, it's going to reach the listing status by 2024 because of all the number of nests. And then, of course, 2010 happened, and a couple of bad things happened in 2010. The oil spill, budget cuts, and this horrible thing. You're like, all of those beautiful nests that we're seeing, it just went down. It went down in 2010. So, of course, everybody thought, dear God, the sky is falling. That's it. Oh my God, the oil spill killed everything. The federal government is not giving us any money. All the turtles are dead. The nests are down. What are you gonna do? What we always do. We just kept going, or like Americans are fond of saying, we kept on trucking. A lot of the young ones here are not gonna get that reference, of course. But we basically kept on trucking because, and this is not to say that our crew is like, it's okay, man, nothing happens, it's all cool, we don't care, devil may care attitude. Not that at all. It's basically not allowing anything, not oil spills or budget cuts or whatever the scientific community says. We're not going to allow you to tell us to stop doing what we know we not only need to do, but we want to do. So we just kept going. Just like the 1985 crew probably felt. I mean, imagine how in the 1995, how many nests did you get? 700. Damn. Should we keep going? Yeah, let's keep on trucking. Forget it. Let's do it. So for the following couple of years, 2011, third biggest year in terms of registered nests in the history of the project. 2012 was the second one. Okay, 2013 saw a 25% decrease in the number of registered nests, but we had seen worse. And then another decrease in 2014, 26% decrease in set. I'm like, oh my God, some other people started saying, sky's falling again. And then we saw an average annual increase of 27% in the number of registered nests from 2015 to 2017. As a matter of fact, 2017 was the biggest year in terms of registered nests with close to 25,000. So also in this past decade, we had the second International Kemp Ridley Symposium at Brownsville in 2014. A lot of you attended that symposium, and perhaps it's time to think about having another one, given the numbers. The commission hosted us in 2015 in Gulfport, and we presented our work to them there. And 2 years ago, the sea turtle early restoration efforts became, the Kemp's project became part of those efforts. Given all the budget cuts and decreased funding from the federal agencies in both countries, not just in the United States, it is through an agreement with the Natural Resources Trustees for the state of Texas that the Kemp's Ridley project keeps supporting the conservation work at the 6 turtle camps in Tamaulipas. 2 years ago, we also celebrated 50 years of Kemp's Ridley conservation in Mexico. By the way, that year we had a 30% increase on the number of nests from 2015 to 2016. So it was a good year. We had fun. And as mentioned, last year was the best year ever, with close to 25,000 nests. That was a 35.6% increase from the number of registered nests in 2016. So that was a pretty good year last year. And here comes the update on the 2018 season. The season unofficially began February 21st. Thankfully, many of our crew members in the South Kemp are fishermen, so they can record this. And the first nest was in March 29th at Rancho Nuevo. That big female nested in Rancho Nuevo. And the last nest of this year was registered in August 11th. In terms of numbers, 17,945 nests were registered, which makes 2018 the sixth highest number of registered nests in the history of the project. As always, Rancho Nuevo has more nests than all the other camps, right there, 12,000. And the index beaches, which are Tepehuas, Rancho Nuevo, and Barra del Tordo, comprise almost 90% of the nesting for this year. As mentioned, Rancho Nuevo has the biggest percentage of nesting, with 72% of the nesting this year, and the index beaches representing 90% of the nests. 60% of these nests were protected in corrals, and the almost 30% were left in situ, and their incubation was monitored. The rest were either taken by predators or poached, although the poaching is basically insignificant. It's not a problem anymore, thankfully. And one of the recommendations of the Kemp Ridley working group and the expert working group is that we protect at least 10,000 nests in the 3 index beaches to ensure recruitment into the population. So that was achieved, no problem. We also had three arribadas this year: April 14, May 10 for Mother's Day in Mexico, as always, and the May 26 arribada, which we'll come back to in a little bit. In terms of hatchlings, we released almost 830,000 hatchlings. Again, one of the recommendations and one of the criterions for downlisting the species is to release at least 300,000 hatchlings from Rancho Nuevo, Barra del Tordo, and Tepehuajes. And this year we released 730,000 hatchlings from those 3 beaches. So objective achieved, recommendation followed. Now, we not only do conservation work, we also take care of some research projects and an education program throughout the season. First, the sex ratio project we do with Dr. Wibbles and the University of Alabama at Birmingham, which we've been doing for 20 years. It's been 20 years since Tane and I met and been working on this project. And it is the largest long-term sea turtle nesting beach temperature database to date. Now, when we started this 20 years ago, not a lot of nesting beaches in the world were doing the sex ratio thing, and so Tane started the whole thing with the hobos and the data loggers, and now this technique is adapted and adopted in a lot of sea turtle conservation camps all over the world. We also have helped Dr. Donna Shaver with satellite telemetry, and of interest is this one that her name is Julieta. Well, that's what they named her. She was tagged in the 2015 season, and she came back during the 2017 season, and she stopped transmitting on April 7 of this year. And according to Dr. Shaver's records, that's the longest period of transmission time for the sea turtle satellite telemetry. So that's a pretty cool fact right there. Thanks to the support of the Commission, we started a tag recapture program in 2014. We have continued this tag recapture program through our fundraising efforts at the Gladys Porter Zoo. This is probably going to be the last year of this tag recapture study. Well, we hope not. It's just that we're going to change it a little bit, and it's going to be just a recapture study depending on the resources that we obtain for next year. Also with Dr. Wibbles, we're using drones, and again, cutting edge technology, pioneering the techniques and the methodologies to use drones as part of our conservation efforts. There's Dr. Wibbles flying a drone, which he lost. Somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, I don't know how many drones Tane has lost, but we take pictures of them to remember them. So as mentioned, it's a pretty cool. It's not just to take cool pictures, which is good for. I mean, don't get me wrong. This is a pretty cool picture from a drone, and it takes great videos that Dane's going to share. But it also allows us to study the dynamics of the arribada, which I'm not going to step on Dr. Wibbles. He's going to talk about that. It's a pretty cool project, and you're in for a treat. Now, this picture from the May 26th arribada. It's about probably 500 meters of beach, and there's over 500 turtles there. So in one shot, you get more turtles than you had in a whole year in 1985. So we come a long way from 1985 to 2018, just seeing all those nesting females. Not all of them nested, they tried. And it was probably 10,000 females that came ashore that day at Rancho Nuevo. So that's the biggest number of females that came ashore in one day in one place in the history of the project, which makes this a very good year as well. And we continue with our educational program. We do not have an official formal sea turtle conservation education program, but we've been doing it for so long that whenever a company or a municipality or the state government of Tamaulipas have an educational program or environmental week or Earth Day, they invite us. So we're part of that. We use infographic posters, and that's part of a state government Kemp Ambassadors Program. We also have our annual fundraiser at the zoo called Yapupalooza. You're all invited for next year in June 8th. And so we come a long way from in 40 years, from 1978 to this year. That's a picture of Rancho Nuevo. A little bit of infrastructure improvement there. And from almost 1,000 to 25,000, and close to 300,000 registered nests and 15 million hatchlings. So it's a very, very successful project. And if there's a couple of you here that were involved in the project in some way, shape, or form, and it really doesn't matter how small or big the contribution was, thank you very much to those people that were, because otherwise the Kemp sea turtle would be part of this slide. And this is not, it's not me being corny, like, oh, it's the truth. If it hadn't been for the project and the work of so many people, it worked so hard, the Kemp sea turtle would be extinct. We would not be talking about those right now. So thank you very much. And for those of us that came after, we truly stand in the shoulders of giants, and we're going to do our best not to disappoint you. But it's very hard. I'm not gonna lie to you. It's very, very hard to keep going with this project. It's like getting resources for the operation of this project is like walking in a blizzard uphill. But we're, keep on trucking, right? But the project itself has survived for 40 years. How has it survived? Well, first of all, the turtles themselves. We have talked about this, and we tend to underestimate the turtles. They're very, very smart turtles, and so we shouldn't underestimate it. The second factor is the crew. We have the very best field crew in the planet. Those are the best guys and gals you will find, very hardworking. And number three, the level of cooperation that this project has seen in the past 40 years is pretty much unheard of. It's very cool that the Gladys Border Zoo has been a part of this for 40 years. And here are some of our government partners, binational, and some of our non-government partners. So this is very cool. And the project has survived because of this level of cooperation. And this level of cooperation is present right now in our biological station in Playa Miramar, which we presented this year, and we hope to expand in the following years. And that's Andres Herrera's widow. We were very lucky to have Andres Herrera's family be with us in the presentation of the biological station. And us before the party. Okay, before I finish, I'm going to give you the real numbers now and a proposal. So remember when I said it's endemic to the Gulf of Mexico? It's not endemic to the 5 states. It's not endemic to Texas. It's not endemic to Tamaulipas. It's not endemic to Veracruz or Long Island, apparently. It's endemic to the Gulf of Mexico. It's one Gulf of Mexico. And see, here are some of the nesting beaches. And so this year in 2018, from the Bolivar Peninsula in Texas all the way to Santander Beach in Veracruz, we basically registered a little over 20,000 nests. So that's the real number. It's not the Tamaulipas number, it's not the Texas number, it's not the Veracruz number. It's the Gulf of Mexico. It's one species in one Gulf, over 30 nesting beaches. So the proposal is this. We need to, at the end of this session, we're going to have a Q&A, and we're going to talk about what needs to be done. So we need to do education programs. Yes. We need to do research. Yes. We need to keep going with the conservation. Yes. We need to do a stock assessment. Yes. We need to do all of this to save this beautiful species. So when we're done talking about all of these, and perhaps we can get together again in Brownsville in 3 years and talk about what we're going to be doing for the next 3 years to figure out how we can keep saving these species from extinction. And we can have a party at the zoo. We can have another symposium, the third international symposium. This is a great opportunity. The potential for research and management and cooperation is right here with this species, with this project. And so let me know what you think about this proposal in 3 years. Hopefully we can get together again. Maybe the commission can be here as well. That'll be great. And I thank you very much.
As Jaime stated, we are going to have a question and answer session here in just a little bit. So please hold all your questions, remember them, and the whole panel will be up here to answer questions at a later date, or a later time, I should say. Right now, we have Dr. Thane Wybels from the University of Alabama, Birmingham. He is going to talk about nesting behavior of the Kemp's Ridley.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission for inviting us. I'm going to change bases a little bit here. And first of all, I'll just caution you that I'm basically preaching to the choir, number one, and the other thing, very much sold on this, so please excuse the hyperbole. But what I want to really drive home is the fact that when you're working with the Kemp's Ridley, it's very easy to sell to the public, and sell to the public is something that a really cool species and what I consider a signature species for the Gulf of Mexico. It, unlike other sea turtles, has a very limited distribution. If you take a green sea turtle, you can find them throughout the world. Leatherbacks throughout the world. Hawksbills throughout the world. Kemp's Ridley, Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic coast of the United States, but it's doing most of its biology in the Gulf of Mexico. And it's interesting from that angle from three basic things. Number one, evolution, ecology, and cultural history that it's actually had in the Gulf of Mexico. And I'll start off with evolution, and this could be a seminar in itself, and I'm working on this. But the whole idea is the Kemp's Ridley's been around for about 3 million years, and it coincides with the formation of the Gulf of Mexico. And I firmly believe, and everything's making sense on this, that it provided a great pocket so that it could evolve on its own, not around the world, but in the Gulf of Mexico itself. But again, that's a seminar in itself. From an ecological standpoint, Nathan will talk about this a little bit later, but it performs its entire life history in the Gulf of Mexico. So, you know, we think ranching away when we think of Kemp's Ridley's, but that's just a couple months out of its life every 2 or 3 years, all right? Most of the time, it's up here in Texas or Alabama or Mississippi or down in the Yucatan, et cetera. And it's going through oceanic existence up here and then settling into tidal areas, et cetera. And then finally it hits adult reproduction and decides, hey, every couple of years I'm gonna migrate down to Rancho and lay some eggs. And so the Gulf of Mexico ecologically is very important. And the other thing is since it is kind of a signature species and it's a higher trophic level, that is, it's feeding on crabs and shrimp and various other things opportunistically, it represents kind of a canary in the coal mine for the Gulf of Mexico. That is, if the Gulf of Mexico is in good shape, the abundance of the Kemp's Ridley is in good condition. And so that's the type of thing where it's a sentinel species, as we often say, and it reflects the health of the Gulf of Mexico. And one thing that I'm really hooked on, so I apologize for this in advance, is the cultural history. And I'm gonna start off with this a little bit more in detail and kind of give you a feel for how people of the Gulf of Mexico contributed to actually saving the species, and not only saving it, but learning about the very unique biology, et cetera. And we always think of the western Gulf of Mexico when we think of the Kemp's Ridley, but I'm going to start the story all the way over in the eastern Gulf of Mexico at Key West, because that's where it was discovered for the scientific world. All right. And there was a guy, Richard Moore Kemp, and he grew up out in the Bahamas. Little would you believe it, but he grew up on Green Turtle Cay. And, you know, back in the mid 1800s. He apparently loved turtles. Okay, if you're living on an island out in the Bahamas, you see sea turtles. You see the green sea turtles coming up in nests. You see hawksbill sea turtles, etc. Well, when he's a teenager, he moves to Key West, and he's in Key West. He happens to live about 2 blocks from the epicenter for the sea turtling industry in the United States. Okay, and they're landing thousands and thousands of pounds of turtles, and he's over there looking, and he's saying, "Hey, like there's a green." There's a hawksbill. What the heck's this one? Okay, we never saw these things out in the Bahamas. All right, and he sees a Kemp's Ridley. Okay, he's also well read. He's from a relatively wealthy family that are merchants, and he starts contacting the people, the big hot shots in the scientific world. And I'll backtrack 1 second just to show you. And he's a turtle fanatic. Now, I'm assuming that's the case because he writes all these letters and things. But if you don't need more information, this was out of his family Bible. And if you notice right there, his firstborn son is Joseph Turtle Kemp. Okay, so you got to know he's on board with the turtles. All right, but the point being, he starts bugging the hot shots in the scientific world. In particular, a guy by the name of Samuel Garman, who is the top ichthyologist, herpetologist in the United States and one of the tops in the world. He was actually a student of Louis Agassiz, who was one of the greatest scientists of the 1800s and came up with concepts like the ice ages, et cetera. And he's saying, hey, we've got a new turtle down here that you guys don't know about, all right? He sends specimens from Key West to Harvard, et cetera, and he says it's a peculiar turtle. And not only does he say it's a peculiar turtle, he says, this thing doesn't nest around here. Nobody's ever seen it nest. We got to the point we think it's a quote-unquote bastard turtle that's a crossbreed between a green turtle and a loggerhead. And that's the story as of 1880, all right? They never see it nest. It's around. Everybody knows it. The fishermen are catching it. The fishermen are eating it, all right? Various areas of the Gulf of Mexico. And so Kemp, based on the enthusiasm Garman, based on the enthusiasm that Kemp had, names the turtle after Kemp. And so that's how it all started, 1880s. Next on the agenda is a guy by the name of Archie Carr. And Archie Carr is the dean of sea turtle biology. He's at University of Florida. And back in the 1930s, one of his colleagues says, hey, you got to come down here to the Florida Keys. And his colleague, Stu Springer, who later becomes one of the great shark biologists for NOAA, okay? And he's running shark fishery down in the Keys. And he says, we've got this nasty turtle, okay? Calls it an evil-natured turtle, flat and gray. It would rip up my shark nets, etc. So Carr goes down there, okay, in 1938, right as they complete the overseas highway. And he goes out with a local fisherman from Matecumbe Bay, which is like Marathon. And he goes out with Josiah. And Josiah tells him, Ridley's is always mad. He says, you can't keep a Ridley on its back. It'll break its heart. And that's where it gets its name, the heartbreak turtle, all right? But the whole idea, if you look at the personality of a Ridley compared to a green, like when they catch a green in a turtle net, it just kind of flops a little bit. A Ridley will sit there and fight you and start biting you and things like that. It's a very irascible turtle, all right? And so that's how Archie Carr gets to know the Kemp's Ridley, and that catches his attention. And so he then, for the next 20 years, starts searching for this beach. He says, I don't believe this stuff that's held in since the 1880s. This turtle's got a nest somewhere. They're all over the place. I'm talking. You can find them up in Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana. And he says, they've got a nest somewhere, okay? And so he starts searching, all right? He searches Florida, the Caribbean, the northern Gulf of Mexico, and finds no evidence of the Kemp's ridley. He has no logical explanation how you have an abundant, quote unquote, signature species for the Gulf of Mexico, and it doesn't nest, okay? Interestingly, he considers it basically one of the most mysterious animals in North America. He is a prolific writer, and he sets it up in everyone's mind, okay, that this is a really cool species with a real mystery to it, the riddle of the Ridley. And what he didn't know is that the mystery had already been solved, but it had been solved by someone who was not a scientist and didn't understand the significance. Well, he understood the significance of the Arabata, but he didn't understand the significance of the Kemp's Ridley. And that was back to Andres Herrera, who Jaime was talking about. And he was a contractor or actually a self-made businessman, let's say, from Tampico. And the thing about Andres, if you go back 100 years, we didn't have conservationists. What we had are people that are interested in sports fishing and sports hunting and things like that. And that's what Andres was, okay? He was also relatively wealthy, so he had an airplane, and he was an avid photographer and had a 16mm camera, all right? And so he would go out and go hunting and fishing all the time. And he was very familiar with the Mexican coast since he lived in Tampico. And one of the places that he went was a place right there called Barra del Tordo, which is one of the main nesting beaches that we have nowadays. And it's a major fishing camp. It was Campo Andres or Campo San Andres. And he would talk to the guy there, and the guy there says, hey, there's this turtle that comes out, but it doesn't just come out and nest. It comes out, you won't have anything for days, and then you'll have thousands and thousands of turtles on the beach. And Herrera doesn't know anything about Archie Carr and the books that he's written or anything like that. But what he realizes is this is really cool. This is a cool biological phenomenon, and I want to actually record it. And so for the next 2 years, Andres Herrera flies 33 flights on his own. This is like aerial surveys, okay? 2-year aerial surveys, 33 flights from Tampico to the United States, back and forth, trying to find this because these guys have told him how cool it is, and he totally believes them. And finally, okay, he hits the jackpot on June 18th, 1947, okay? He's got thousands of turtles over a mile of beach, and it lasts for 4 hours or more, where these turtles are just solid, okay, on the beach for 2 kilometers or so. And the interesting thing, the story goes, Andres was out flying one day and saw these turtles, took pictures of them, didn't realize the significance, and threw the film in the drawer. No. He did like 33 flights, 2 years, realized the importance. He then went and started contacting all the people. He contacts Disney. He contacts MGM. He contacts RKO. He sends Life magazine pictures. And everybody says, hey, that's really cool, but we don't think it's going to be something that people like. And so it gets buried, all right? And so he does have it literally in a drawer at home because all the people he's contacting, he's a very well-known guy, okay, and he contacts that. And it takes another person from Texas to actually bring it to the scientific community, Henry Hildebrand. All right, he's an ichthyologist and herpetologist from Corpus Christi. All right, he's an expert on fisheries. He is the classic fisheries biologist. He's out talking to every shrimper. That's how you learn, or every fisherman. That's how you learn about the fisheries, etc. And he was also researching the history of the occurrence of sea turtles in the western Gulf of Mexico. And he'd read The Windward Road, which was Archie Carr's book talking about the mystery and the riddle of the Ridleys. And so he knew the whole setup. He knew the riddle of the Ridley, etc. And he goes and he starts checking down in Mexico. He's fluent in Spanish, goes to Mexico previously. Or I had the good fortune of going through Henry's office files after he died. And this is very hard to read, but this is one where he's talking to Francis McDonald, who ran that fishing camp down at Barra del Tordo. And Henry would write in like green one day and then red the next, so it's kind of hard to see. I apologize for that. But the first line, it has like, talk to this guy, Andres Herrera. He apparently has a film with lots of turtles on it, all right? And this is a phone call he's having with Francis McDonald. So there's a lot more to this. It's a seminar in itself. But the whole idea is he contacts him. Herrera says, yay, finally, somebody wants the film. And so Hildebrand says, I'll come down and get it. And Andres says, oh, I got buddies who come up to the United States all the time. I'll have them send it to you within the next week or so. So all of a sudden, Hildebrand gets the film, and he's thinking he's going to see a normal nesting beach. But what he sees, 2 things. Number one, he gets the Kemp's Ridley nesting beach. But the second thing that he doesn't expect is he gets the Arabata. okay? This is this mass nesting event that is not yet known to the scientific world. And the whole idea, that was the riddle of the Ridley. That's why they couldn't find it. Number one, it's a remote beach, but you can go there for a month straight and not see anything, and then they all come up on one day, all right? And so Hildebrand, this is unfolding in front of Hildebrand's eyes as he's watching this film, et cetera. And so the whole thing is he documented the Arabada nesting, and that's something that I think kind of goes unknown with Herrera. A lot of times it says, oh, he found the nesting beach, but he understood the Arabada itself, which was this cool thing. And I'll do one last little clip on Hildebrand. He invited Carr. Carr came in, flew in, went to this meeting at Austin, Texas, okay? And Hildebrand gives a talk, and his talk, which is up at the top, is the identification of a nesting beach for sea turtles in the western Gulf of Mexico, very low key. And to show you Hildebrand, about an hour and a half earlier, he'd given a talk on, this is where he's like uncovering one of the greatest zoological mysteries in the last 3 or 4 decades. And like an hour and a half before, he's giving a talk on the effect of salinities on minnows out here in the Laguna Madre, okay? And that was just classic Henry Hildebrand. Carr comes down, watches the film, is totally elated. The mystery of the Ridley is saved. Carr immediately hops on the plane, flies back, and they asked Henry, what did you think? Did he like it? And he says, and this is in classic Henry vernacular, he was quite flabbergasted for sure. that was Henry Hildebrand. But anyway, the mystery was solved, okay? And the importance of it was not only Arabada, but was the whole idea is when you work with an endangered species, it's often like, oh my goodness, it's almost extinct. And then they say, well, what would it used to be like? Well, everybody says there was a lot of them, but we don't know. We don't have a quantification. And the Herrera film provided a benchmark. It provided a historic benchmark that we could go back and look at. And in the case of, in the case of that film, Hildebrand and Carr had both estimated 40,000 turtles on the beach that day, all right? And Hildebrand actually, I've looked at his notes. I can't find the Rosetta Stone on this, but he had calculations. He was looking at those like frames of the 16 millimeter and doing it. I can't understand exactly how he did it. So it wasn't just haphazard. They were saying 40,000. Well, we went back and reassessed that about 2 or 3 years ago. And what we did is we turned the students loose on it. So this was student power, where we took the Herrera film, and the Herrera family was nice enough to give us their highest resolution copies, okay? So we got copies of that, and we take something like this, we turn it loose on the undergraduate students and say, okay, tell me how many turtles are on this beach, all right? And they would go to this, where they number every turtle on the beach, et cetera. And we came up with about 28,000 compared to 40,000. And we're trying to be as conservative as possible, okay? So that people can't say, oh, you're overestimating it, that type of thing. And so it's like, okay, 28, 40, big deal. However, the thing we had that Carr and Hildebrand didn't have was we had recent data of the behavior of Kemp's Ridleys. And so what we did, okay, was we looked at how big the Arabadas were in recent years, and they were starting to get big Arabadas. And we said, okay, if there are 28,000 turtles in an Arabada back in 1947, what does that represent relative to the whole nesting season? And so we took the largest Arabadas they had in recent years and looked at the proportion of turtles nesting relative to the whole season and used that to extrapolate out to how many turtles should have been nesting back in 1947 based on 28,000 turtles in a single day and 3 Arabadas, that type of thing. And what we came up with was about 140,000 turtles, okay? And so, or excuse me, 120,000 turtles. So if you look at the recovery here, and this is one of the great things about the program. One of the problems with the recovery is that you look and you say, oh, you guys are doing a great job. And not only that, but that population is really coming back, so we can probably back off a little bit or something like that. But it's a whole different story, okay, when you look at the historic levels, okay, and you put it compared to the historic levels, and all of a sudden we have a very small percentage of what it used to be. The question is it going to come back? And, 10 years ago, Selina Happel, who was doing all the modeling and is a great modeler, said, this thing's on an exponential increase. It doesn't matter what you do, it's going to be coming back. But it didn't do that. It started leveling off. And both Benny and Charles will tell you some possibilities, okay, of what's going on today in some of the later talks. It could be that there's been some short-term impacts. It could be that maybe the Gulf of Mexico we have today is not the Gulf of Mexico that Andres Herrera had. And so it may not actually be able to hold that type of thing. And so not only do we have a signature species for the Gulf of Mexico, but potentially we have a species that is acting as a sentinel, and it goes as the Gulf goes. So if you have a good Gulf, you have an increase in production of size of Ridley or arabatas, et cetera. And the last thing I'm going to do, I'll leave you kind of with that, but we've been studying, we do a lot of different things down there, but we've been studying the arabata since it's such a cool biological phenomenon. And the whole idea, this is a thing where species are coming from all over the Gulf of Mexico over a several-month period and concentrating in that area. And what we're doing is we're flying drones out there and trying to look at how they concentrate, when they concentrate, where is the mating, where is the critical habitat, that type of thing. And so I've got a couple of videos. Let's go with video 1. And they're both real short videos, about 2 minutes or less. Okay. This is one we made in 2017, and it kind of gives you an overview of the whole motion of the thing. I apologize for the glitchy start. That was, but credit Chang'e for it. And again, the thing to think about with the Kemp's Ridley, it's not a Rancho Nuevo thing. It is a Gulf of Mexico thing. It occurs throughout. It lives, okay, here in Texas, and it lives in Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi and Florida and up along the Atlantic coast and down in the Yucatan. But then when they finally made it, that 13 to 15 years or 12 to 15 years and reach sexual maturity, they migrate, and they migrate to Rancho Nuevo and or Padre Island and or Veracruz, okay, to nest. And so what we see on the drones is all of a sudden, if you go there in, like January, you don't see any turtles offshore, very few. And then they start showing up. You'll see the turtles popping up here in the surf. And with the drones, you can see both males and females. And one of the things we've been doing, I don't have time today, but we've been documenting locations where fishermen have seen them mate, okay, or we've actually seen Javier was able to get some courtship behavior this year where they're actually kind of looking at each other and trying to decide whether or not they want to mate. This is April 21 of 2017, and normally we get 1 or 2 turtles on a survey, and all of a sudden now we're getting 5, okay, or 6. And this year we got up to about, on a single survey, which is about an 18-minute survey, we were getting up to 24 the day or several days before the arabata. And then this is the day before an arabata last year. And what you'll see are turtles popping up in the surf, okay? They're all over, and they're right in the surf zone. This is the day before. They're kind of like bobbing up and down, and you'll see them. Herrera said when he flew his plane over, it was like confetti in the water. And now I kind of understand what you're saying, because as they bob up, they reflect the water. And we're able to pick up about 100 turtles in 1 kilometer of beach, and they're just there like, boy, I really want to nest. Go ahead and go to the second video. Yeah. And then the next day was the arabata. The reason I didn't show you that one is because we got a much better one. This is an arabata from May 26th of this year, and we're using the videos now to actually fly over an arabata to be able to quantify accurately the number of turtles on the beach. All right, and so this is May 26th at Rancho. This is, again, we got a great photographer down there who puts together an entertaining video, so you saw like the drone in at the start. But if you look, what you'll see is, it's a little bit hard to see on this one, but this thing is just full of turtles right off the beach. Again, from Mississippi, from Alabama, from all over the Gulf of Mexico, Florida, Texas, etc. And they're all hanging out right there in that surf zone, kind of deciding, hey, it's time to go. And you can see the crew's ready for them, okay? They're on the beach, ready to go. They know it's coming. The guys are seeing the heads in the surf, etc. And then all of a sudden, they start showing up. And over about an 800-meter area of beach, again, I turn the students loose on this, and I say, okay, run this 20-minute video and give me every turtle that's on there and what zone they're in, that type of stuff. We're picking up 1,800 turtles, the majority of which are within about 300 meters of beach, okay? You'll see where it gets dense, etc. Bear in mind, 702 turtles over 3 months, okay? And this is, I think, this lasted at least 4 or 5 hours, okay? At the end of the thing, we have a little bit over estimation, I think. But the whole point is you got 4 or 5 hours. This thing started at about 7:30 in the morning and was still running strong. We're doing the dynamics on it right now based on some wildlife cameras, but still running strong by about 11 or so that morning, okay? And you'll just see they're coming, they're going, etc. And this is a problem we're going to face in that how do you quantify how many turtles are nesting in this arbotta? And you have to do that in order to accurately estimate the recovery of this population, because now we're getting a huge amount of the entire population nesting on a single day, okay? And so we've been doing that, and I'll just finish off back to my talk, if that's possible. I forgot to mention that at the start. What we had wildlife cameras out there also, okay? And so we had wildlife cameras that we positioned at the mid part of that arbotta, and they took like a frame, but they take a frame every 15 seconds for all day, okay? So we literally got elapsed photography on the thing. And what I did was I turned the students loose, and we'd do it, and there'd be 20 turtles in this frame. And I'd say, count every turtle in that frame, okay? And once you count every turtle in that frame, all right, yeah, there we go. Once you count every turtle in that frame, follow it. Go for every 15 seconds or every 15 seconds and follow it and tell me what it does. And what they found was that in a frame like this with like 20 turtles or something like that, only 2 nested. The others either were disturbed and moved out of the frame, or they moved in and moved out of the frame. And it's quite possible that we'd be overestimating the number of nests that we're producing by simply counting the number of turtles on the beach, because we have to know how long they stay and how many go back out into the water. And so that's one of the things we're going to be addressing next year with this type of stuff. And again, 2 of these nested. The D's, the little red dots, are disturbed, meaning somebody walked on top of them, and so then they took off and started moving someplace else. The P's are ones, the white ones are the ones that just move right through the area. They kind of walked through and said, no, it's too busy. And so the whole idea, some of these, instead of spending 40 minutes nesting, are on the beach for an hour, okay? And some of them may very well be going back. We don't know. We're going to do that with drone next year. And so with that, I hope I've given you kind of an overview of the significance of a signature species for the Kemp's Ridley, or a signature species for the Gulf of Mexico, as well as a sentinel species. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thane. Next on the agenda, we have Dr. Nathan Putman, and he's going to talk about spatial and temporal variation in Kemp's Ridley abundance, patterns, mechanisms, and implications.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Thank you for inviting me to participate as well. It's a pleasure to get to talk to you about, as I think you've heard already, something so just inherently fascinating, but also something of cultural conservation management importance. So I'll be talking, as Jeff said, about spatial and temporal variation in Kemp's Ridley abundance. I'll talk about some of the patterns that we see, the mechanisms that drive those patterns, as well as perhaps some of the implications of those patterns and mechanisms. So we'll start with, there we go. Here's the outline for the talk. So I'll give you an overview of conceptual model, the migration triangle, understanding linkages between life stages, and using that conceptual model to get at some of the mechanisms that drive spatial variation in abundance, some of the mechanisms that drive temporal variation in abundance, and I'll spend a bit more time on that temporal aspect of it and share some of the cutting edge research on, meaning it hasn't been worked out in great detail, but cutting edge research on strandings as a possible index of recruitment, and exploring whether trends in strandings can provide an indication, sort of a forecast of future nesting output. And then I'll discuss some of my views on what the next steps are needed to sort of bring this all together to a useful place. All right, so the migration triangle, linking life stages. This is adapted from the book Fish Migration, Hardin-Jones, Roy Hardin-Jones, back in 1968. And this is about as uncomplicated as it gets, right? And it's glosses over some aspects of things, but it's nice. It explains a lot of the variability that you see, a lot of the movement patterns you see in diverse marine animals with 3 simple vertices. And so what he sort of talked about was that you typically, in many instances, you have this reproductive area that is linked to nursery grounds via oceanic dispersal, which is then linked. You have then recruitment into adult foraging grounds. And then for many species, they return to their reproductive area, and for those who, unlike, say, maybe a Pacific salmon, which conveniently dies after it spawns, these many species will go back to the foraging grounds and sort of make this loop multiple times over their lifespan. Now, for the Kemp's Ridley, what this looks like then is, okay, so we've got a nesting beach. They disperse to their oceanic nursery habitat. They recruit to continental shelf foraging grounds, and then they home back to the nesting beach where they themselves had hatched out, typically. And then they have this post-reproductive movement back to their foraging grounds, and they complete that circuit every several years. All right, so reproductive areas of the Kemp's Ridley. We've gone over this quite a bit. The bulk of them are in western Gulf of Mexico. White squares represent the main nesting regions in the western Gulf of Mexico. You certainly have sporadic nesting here and there. To the south here, you see it across Florida and in the Carolinas occasionally. But far and away, as Jaime pointed out, nesting's in the western Gulf of Mexico. And so that's where they nest. And then you have the dispersal. All right, so there's our dispersal stage. You have offshore swimming and ocean currents contributing to the dispersal. So little turtles are hatched. They have this yolk sac. It's a residual energy storage, sort of like a tiny Duracell battery attached to their plastron. And they use that to power their offshore migration for the first, probably 48 hours, at least in loggerheads. So they swim offshore, and they get caught up in these currents that then disperse them to their oceanic habitat. And here's some maps of predicting the dispersal and potential recruitment of these young turtles. So we can put virtual turtles off the coasts of Texas and Tamaulipas and Veracruz. We can put them in an ocean circulation model and see where they would disperse for specific cohorts or things like that. And so we can see a relative abundance after, say, a year and a half of oceanic dispersal. See lots of turtles in red, many fewer in blue. This is a log-scaled graph. This is the average age of turtles in a given area. And you can see where they're likely to sort of recruit, where they're likely to fall out as they grow. And part of recruitment, so the dispersal, you have that lot of contributions of ocean currents and things like that, and offshore swimming. In recruitment, you probably get to some oriented swimming. So this is a graphic based on some work I did with Professor Kate Mansfield at the University of Central Florida, putting tracking devices on turtles, young, sort of that oceanic stage turtle, putting tracking devices on them. These red histograms, circular histograms, show the swimming direction of about 20 tracked sea turtles. And that I should point out that that's swimming direction, not movement direction. So we deployed things like oceanic drifters and used ocean circulation models to subtract out the ocean current component of the movement and see what are the turtles trying to do. And so this isn't necessarily where they go, because ocean currents might be pushing them too, but this is what they're trying to do. And so in this portion of the Gulf, you see sort of this bimodal swimming, east to west, not much north and south. But for those turtles that do find their way down here, a very strong northward swimming, which to me implies that when turtles are in the northern Gulf, they're pretty happy there. a good way to stay there is to swim sort of east and west, and you stay on towards the shelf break. If you find yourself making your way out of the Gulf, go back, swim north. Avoid being swept out into the Atlantic. It's not to say you won't get swept out into the Atlantic if you're in stronger currents than you can swim against, but as far as recruitment into the foraging grounds, they're probably trying to stay in the Gulf. Now, that gets us to the question a bit, how might turtles know where they are to know which way to swim? How do you know you're in blue water off the coast here, you're in blue water off the coast here? How do you know you're up here and you should swim east and west instead of swimming north there? And what we've shown in a variety of marine animals is that they actually can perceive aspects of Earth's magnetic field. Sea turtles have been a key study group in this work of sort of understanding the sensory biology of migration. Unfortunately, not really any work has been done on Kemp's Ridley, but we know this in some pretty good detail for loggerheads and even green turtles. And so what we suspect is that turtles can tell where they are based on properties of the magnetic field. And I won't go into this in great detail, but Earth's magnetic field can be, apparently just like triangles, can be explained as sort of this vector, a triangle. Field strength increases as you go poleward, it decreases as you go equatorward. And so if you can measure what magnetic intensity you're in, you could get an indication of your latitudinal position. And similarly, other aspects of the magnetic field suggest this inclination angle, so the angle that the field lines are intersecting the surface of the Earth. If you could measure the angle that the magnetic field is impinging upon you, then you could have an indication of your latitudinal position. You could have something of a map of where you are, whether you're north or south of where you had previously been. And we suspect that that is a possible way for eventually targeting the home beach. So natal homing is possible using a magnetic map. This is results from a decade ago, from 2008, using geomagnetic models of how the field drifts over time. And if you look at if you program turtles to try to return to their magnetic home place, they can do that with pretty good precision. And so this is, there's Rancho Nuevo. If you remember the magnetic field at Rancho Nuevo and you try to come back 10 or 15 years later using the same inclination angle, you can find your way with pretty good precision back to that area where presumably some other cues would allow you to pinpoint your beach or would allow you to make decisions about when to go on shore. So this is possibility is how they find their way back with such seemingly great precision to their natal sites. And so what we have here then is as ocean, so the mechanisms. So using this migration triangle to understand the mechanisms of spatial and temporal variation and abundance, we can know that things like ocean currents dominate movement. Compass cues to move offshore are most important here. As you go into this recruitment phase, swimming behavior and ocean currents become sort of equally important, and map cues, where are you, become increasingly important to the turtles. And then for getting back to the nesting beach, swimming dominates the movement component. They can swim with or against currents, but swimming dominates movement, and map cues are most important because they can decide where they would like to go. All right, so thinking about linkages and life stages and those sorts of things. So what we sort of hypothesize is that spatial variation and nest abundance is related to how well offshore conditions facilitate dispersal to nursery habitat. So here is this is a mean percentage of nesting by state: Texas, Tamaulipas, Veracruz. everybody is in Tamaulipas. I know it's a Gulf turtle. I know it's a Gulf turtle. You know it's a Gulf turtle. Most of them are in Tamaulipas. Why? So this map on your right here shows a couple things. We have plotted climatic suitability of nesting habitat. And this is from somebody else's model, David Pike. And it shows excellent, good, and this moderate marginal nesting habitat. And you can see the entire ring here is excellent habitat, except maybe right there it's good. So the nesting habitat's fine from a climatic perspective. What we have here is this daily transport distance in kilometers. So thinking back to those ocean circulation models, put in a bunch of virtual particles off the coasts here. So each dot represents the location of one little particle, and see how far do they travel in a 24-hour period over the course of about 10 or so nesting seasons, or excuse me, hatching seasons. And what's abundantly clear is that nesting is centered right where the greatest amount of offshore transport is. So that implies that, talking a little bit about Dr. Willis hinting at evolution, if you had a uniform distribution of nesting 2 million years ago, what you might expect is over thousands and thousands of generations, those turtles that nest here are going to have a better time getting offshore, surviving, and because they home to their natal site, more will come back here to nest later. And so regardless of what the absolute value of abundance is, you would predict that relative abundance should always be highest in Tamaulipas based on these conditions. So then that leads us to another question. Might temporal variability in nest abundance be related to the recruitment dynamics? So we've seen a lot of wiggles on a graph. So this just shows nest counts through time. Could changes be related to how easy from one cohort or so to the next it is for them to recruit to appropriate habitat? And so, as part of this question, we can say, all right, does hatchling production, so part of the recruitment, hatchling production, does that predict future nesting? So the number of hatchlings coming off the beach, does that give you an indication of how many will be nesting? So if this is a 2-year period, and that's about a 10-year period, how many, 12 years later? Likewise, might recruitment, so movement into these areas, predict nesting, say 10 years later? Unfortunately, as Jaime pointed out, we have a lot of data on hatchling production. They count hatchlings that come off the index beaches. And we can see there is a relationship, a pretty strong relationship, that the more hatchlings that were produced 12 years ago, the more nests you have now. It is, which I think I might have, well, no, that's fine enough. So it appears to be maybe a logarithmic relationship. At some point, you can keep putting in more hatchlings, and you don't get that many more nests in return. But this is sort of consistent with that idea. As far as the recruitment data, we don't really have a standardized, like we do on the nesting beaches, we don't have a standardized index for recruitment. And so we can ask, well, what do we have? And there's a stranding network that's been around that counts the numbers, it's volunteer-based, counting the numbers of people who call in reports and say there's a stranded turtle washed up on the beach. And that is a network that has been built and grown up over the past decades. Folks like Donna Shaver contributing strongly to it in Texas. But each state has their strandings coordinator and has provided us with this annual count of strandings in their region. And a lot of those data have size data associated with them. And so what we've done here is we've taken the size classes of turtles that would be in that sort of recruiting stage. It's a straight carapace length here, and so it corresponds to 2-ish years old. And so this shows temporal variability in the number of strandings in this age class from 85 to 2014. And so a lot of text, but the basics here's just sort of the rationale for doing this. So can we use strandings across Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida to predict nesting in Tamaulipas? So anthropogenic drivers are likely to be an issue. You know, before a turtle can strand, it usually has to die or become compromised in some way. But what if we assume that variation in strandings is driven primarily by variation in abundance of turtles entering the region? You can't strand, you can't get caught up in something if you're not there, right? And so we might expect then that the number of turtles that strand in a given year to correlate with the number of nests deposited 10 years later. And so 1985 strandings might predict 1995, 2008 would predict 2018. And so what I'll show here is some non-parametric correlations to assess whether there is a relationship, and then some regression models to produce equations that we could use to then perhaps forecast Kemp's Ridley nesting into the coming 5-year period. So what we see here is a little bit surprised to see this kind of relationship, but the more strandings in nesting predict less, more strandings in Texas predict less nesting in Tamaulipas 10 years later. Sort of not a particularly strong relationship, and it is again a logarithmic one. If we look at strandings in Louisiana, Alabama, there is essentially no relationship. We could wave our hands about why that might be. Probably some of that has to do with differences in reporting or differences in effort and in strandings reportings over the years, perhaps, or maybe there's just not a relationship. In contrast, what we see in Florida is that there's a pretty strong relationship. When you see more strandings in Florida, you end up with more nesting in Tamaulipas 10 years later. And what might that look like then? So if we just maybe take these at face value for the purposes of this presentation and say, okay, if there is that relationship, if more turtles end up in Florida and more will nest later, if Florida is perhaps an idyllic recruitment zone for Kemp's Ridleys, and when more of them make it there, they are fatter and happier and survive better. What happens? So first, if we're forecasting Kemp's Ridley nesting with hatchling production, this is what we would predict. We would predict future nesting will sort of continue on, but remember there's a logarithmic relationship with hatchling production and nesting, and so what the models predict is that you can put in more nests, you can put in more hatchlings, but you're not necessarily going to get that many more nests out of it. So even though we've had in recent years, 2009, for instance, you had 1 million hatchlings produced, you're not getting much out of them. So now forecasting with recruitment to Florida, we'll call it recruitment, is strandings. You see, a similar level there. The fit's not quite as good. But if you then sort of put those together, so the production plus recruitment, so this is just a simple multiple regression model, what you end up with is that in years where you had a lot of hatchlings and you end up with a lot of those hatchlings going to Florida, you predict many more will come back and nest. And so what this would perhaps suggest is that we might be wiggling around a bit, but thanks in part to the very large number of hatchlings produced and the conditions that might be bringing more turtles to the coast of Florida, we might end up with somewhere between 25,000, 30,000 nests at index beaches based on this sort of statistical model. So possible implications of this work would be that perhaps some regions are more suitable than others for maturing Kemp's Ridleys in the Northern Gulf. Maybe fitness is increased for turtles reaching Florida, and thus when more turtles reach Florida, reproductive output subsequently increases. Perhaps Kemp's Ridleys arriving to Texas, it's a weaker relationship, but it does seem that when you end up with more strandings in Texas, perhaps they're arriving too early, and they might be subject to higher mortality than those recruiting to more eastern regions, which would arrive at later ages. There are fairly robust statistical relationships between hatchling production and strandings. And so that suggests that a 9-year forecast might be possible to set expectations for future population dynamics. So if you count up number of strandings this year, we know hatchling production 2 years ago, we can predict the number of nests with some degree of error, but some degree of uncertainty error. But you have an indication of both the trend, which you get, I think, primarily from the hatchling production, and you get an indication of the variability from that potential recruitment index from Florida strandings. And so the next steps needed are pretty clear here. We should probably build in some corrections for these strandings models to base on differences in observer coverages or wind and current conditions that can account for variability in just a turtle washing up on shore. Should probably consider correcting for anomalous occurrences such as cold stuns and oil spills. And then, again, this is just on the recruitment side of those early age classes. So we should probably incorporate into a full demographic model, incorporate an index of strandings into a full demographic model to account for the contributions of other age classes to nesting. So for instance, previous weak or strong cohorts. And then the idea I'd like to leave you with is that we should be focusing on mechanisms. We should be focusing on mechanisms that drive spatial and temporal variation and abundance. We should be working towards building models that take into account the movement of the species, the movement of individuals, and that by working on sort of a mechanistic model, you can perhaps get away from some of the pitfalls of your statistical relationships working very nicely until they stop. So I think that is where I will leave you, and looking forward to the question and answer time. Thanks.
Thank you, Nathan. Next on the agenda, we have Dr. Donna Shaver, and she is going to talk about internesting, migration, and foraging distribution of adult female Kemp's Ridley turtles.
I think I'm going to be fine. Yeah, I'll be fine. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to the group. I'm really honored to be here today. And I am, as has been mentioned, I'm the Texas coordinator of the Sea Turtle Stranding and Salvage Network and the chief of the Division of Sea Turtle Science and Recovery at Padre Island National Seashore. And I have worked with Kemp's Ridleys for 38 years. I also want to thank my collaborators that I've been working with on this research and who made this paper possible. So thank you to them. As you've heard today already from other wonderful presentations this morning, Kemp's Ridleys nest primarily along the Gulf of Mexico coast in Mexico, with Rancho Nuevo in Tamaulipas being the epicenter of nesting for the species, and Tecolutla and Veracruz, the southern extent of the documented historic nesting range. And the only other country that nesting occurs in is the United States, and in the U.S., most nesting is in Texas, of course, at much lower levels than in Mexico. But in Texas, in particular, the largest nesting is at Padre National Seashore on North Padre Island. Oftentimes we're said to be on South, but we're actually on North. And Padre National Seashore is near the northern extent of the documented historic nesting range for the species. And it is also the site of a 4-decade-long binational effort to form a secondary nesting colony there of the species as a safeguard against extinction. And some of the colleagues who we've worked with over many years on that effort are here today, and I'm so glad to get to speak to you about some of our updates. Fewer than 20 Kemp's Ridley nests are typically recorded in the U.S. outside of Texas annually. This is a graph of the number of Kemp's Ridley nests found in Texas and Mexico through 2018. And far fewer nests are found in Texas, and the scale is in red for them in the red line, than in Mexico, which is the blue scale. But as you can see, the numbers of nests found in both areas have trended similarly in recent years, and they're highly correlated. For, as you've heard this morning, for several years, recovery efforts were showing very promising signs of success, with 15 to 19% increases in annual nest numbers recorded. And population modeling done by Selena and some others reported that in the Kemp's Ridley Recovery Plan predicted that continued exponential increases in nesting would occur for Kemp's Ridleys if protection of the turtles in the marine environment and on the nesting beaches continued. But however, as you've heard, the exponential increases in nesting ended in 2010, and that prompted renewed concern about the recovery status of the species. And on April 20th, 2010, the MC-252 Deepwater Horizon oil spill began in the northern Gulf of Mexico, and it flowed for 87 days. And the cumulative oiling layer, which was developed by NOAA, and the web page where it's located is listed here. That cumulative oiling layer is shown in this graphic in tan and brown. Prior to the spill, there was evidence that in the northern Gulf of Mexico, important foraging and migratory habitat for adult Kemp's Ridleys occurred. This is a graphic from Shaver and Rubio in 2008 that displays all the filtered locations for our platform transmitter terminals, or PTTs, the satellite transmitters, deployed on Kemp's Ridley turtles after they nested at Padre National Seashore. And after they completed nesting for the season, most of the turtles left waters off the nesting beach and traveled northward parallel to the coast, with their last identified locations in the northern Gulf of Mexico. But in recent years, we have aimed to quantify those foraging areas, the migratory corridor, and the internesting habitat used by adult female Kemp's Ridleys, and identify high-use areas within them. Understanding at-sea habitat use is vital to understanding the possible impacts of the spill and the causes for the unexpected fluctuations in nesting. And additionally, knowing the locations of important habitat may reveal locations where additional protection should be concentrated. And switching state-space modeling, or SSM, couples a statistical model of observation process, that would be the tracking locations and their associated errors, with a model of movement dynamics, such as the random walk model. And when used in combination with satellite tracking data, SSM can reveal when and where turtles are in foraging or internesting behavioral mode versus migration behavioral mode. And subsequently, the data summaries using SSM output can reveal locations of key foraging and internesting sites and migratory corridors. And some examples of the use of SSM in sea turtle studies in recent years are listed here. We have aimed to document the foraging, migratory, and internesting habitat of adult females of this species by satellite tracking turtles from the 3 anchors of the nesting range, Padre Isle National Seashore, Rancho Nuevo, and Tecolootla. And to date, with the help of our partners, we have deployed 221 PTTs on Kemp's Ridleys after they nested at Padre Isle National Seashore, 119 deployed, Rancho Nuevo, 44, and Tecolootla, 58 deployed, and 1 was applied to a Kemp's Ridley that nested in Gulf Shores, Alabama, where Kemp's Ridleys occasionally nest. So the first topic of the 3 that I'm going to talk about are foraging areas. And Shaver et al., 2013, we used SSM to identify foraging areas for post-nesting Kemp's Ridleys with tracking data that we collected through 2011. And this graphic displays the 50% kernel density estimates, or KDEs, the home ranges for the foraging areas identified with those turtles originally tagged at Padre Isle National Seashore, shown in the dark gray, and those turtles originally tagged at Rancho Nuevo, outlined in black with no shading. And we identified important foraging areas in the northern Gulf, as well as off the west coast of Florida and the Yucatan Peninsula. And we identified that multiple turtles foraged along their migratory route prior to their arrival at final foraging sites. And foraging sites were in waters that were a mean of 19 meters deep and 33 kilometers from the nearest mainland coast. This figure is from the same paper and displays turtle tracking days and foraging mapped on a 25 by 25 kilometer grid cells in the Gulf of Mexico, and shows a similar distribution of foraging areas selected. In Hart et al., 2018, which just came out, we updated our foraging area analysis with the addition of turtles tagged during 2012 and 2013, but this time we plotted them on 10 by 10 kilometer grid cells. And we continued to find high-use grid cells concentrated off the northern Gulf, particularly off of Louisiana, but also off of other U.S. Gulf states and some areas in Mexico. This map is an adaptation from Hart et al. In Press, and the shaded blue areas are 50% KDEs that we found for Kemp's Ridley's tract. And as you can see, many of those foraging areas are within the cumulative oiling layer, which in this graphic is shown as a shaded gray area. As part of our natural resource damage assessment study for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill on the impacts to the nesting Kemp's Ridleys and the eggs, we deployed satellite transmitters, and we collected some small skewed samples from the carapace of turtles tracked after they nested at Padre Isle National Seashore and the upper Texas coast during 2010, 11, and 12. And we analyzed those skewed samples for stable isotope signatures. And these results are published in Rice et al. 2017. And here we displayed the centroids for Kemp's Ridley turtles tracked over the cumulative oiling layer. And the open symbols represent centroids for turtles tracked at Padre Isle National Seashore. And the shaded symbols represent centroids for turtles tagged on the upper Texas coast. And the numbers in parentheses indicate overlapping centroids, that is, for multiple turtles. And numbers separated by slashes are nest numbers for turtles that nested more than once in the indicated year. And stable isotope and tracking data indicated that 51.5% of the Kemp's Ridley turtles sampled had stable isotope signatures indicating oil exposure. Now, the second topic to discuss migratory corridors. In Shaver et al. 2016, we used SSM to define the migratory corridor for post-nesting Kemp's Ridley turtles in the Gulf of Mexico, and several of the following slides are from that paper. Most females tracked for more than just a few months migrated from the nesting beach after the nesting season was over, and our results document that near-shore waters of the entire Gulf of Mexico coastline in the U.S. and Mexico must be considered as migratory habitat for the species. Our migratory corridor analysis indicated findings from 66 SSM PTT turtles deployed through 2013 on Kemp's Ridley turtles that nested at Powder Island National Seashore, Rancho Nuevo, Tecalutla, and the one on Gulf Shores. And this figure shows the number of turtle tracking days in migration. And for this, we summarized how many turtles in migration mode were in each cell, regardless of the year. However, this method of analysis can be skewed for individual bias, that is, if a turtle remained in a cell for a long period of time, which is one of the reasons that we prefer the proportional analysis over turtle tracking days. So this graphic portrays the proportion of all SSM turtles that used each 10 by 10 grid cell for migration, again with 66 turtles with migration phase through SSM analysis. We use this approach because we wanted to define the corridor and not just plot the cells that were ever used. And the proportion more clearly shows that a lot of Kemp's Ridleys used this coastal band, and a lot of individuals used some cells during migration mode. And this allowed us to use SSM to derive a probability of a given cell being used in migration mode by all turtles for which SSM worked. And for both analyses, post-nesting migration was documented in the northern and the southern Gulf of Mexico, with high-use migration areas identified off of Louisiana, underscoring the importance of the northern Gulf of Mexico to adult female Kemp's Ridleys and thus to the conservation of the entire species. And we found high-use areas off of the South Texas coast and off of Rancho Nuevo, where the turtles migrated from after completing their nesting season. So when most of the turtles migrated, they used waters that were a mean of approximately 20 meters deep and 26 kilometers from shore. In this figure, the proportion of Kemp's Ridley turtles in migration mode through each cell is displayed by month, from May through October, with May in the top left and October at the bottom right. And the migratory area shifts clockwise around the northern Gulf and counterclockwise around the southern Gulf from May through August. Migration is a relatively short phenomenon, and by fall, fewer turtles are in migration mode. And as described by Shaver et al. In 2013, post-nesting Kemp's Ridleys forage at multiple sites, and there are more limited movements between the foraging sites. According to SSM, migration for post-nesting Kemp's Ridleys occurs primarily from late May through August, with a peak in June. Dates in the late winter and early spring are migrations between foraging sites and do not reflect remigration. Remigration is the return to the nesting beach after spending at least one winter in the foraging grounds. The mean remigration interval for Kemp's Ridleys is thought to be 2 years, But for the last 4 years, we've found through our market capture tagging in Texas that remigration interval to be 3.5 years, much longer. Relatively few PTTs lasted long enough to document movements through remigration. Repeat tracking of individuals afforded the opportunity to study migratory corridors and fidelity to foraging areas. And through 2017, 20 individuals were repeatedly tracked after nesting at Padron National Seashore for between 2 and 4 nesting seasons. And this graphic includes 5 of those 20 incidents. For the turtles repeatedly tracked, we saw pathways consistently used year to year, supporting the migratory corridor concept. 11 of those 20 turtles that were repeatedly tracked ended at the same foraging areas during successive tracks. And this includes turtle P92, that's in the middle on the left, that followed the same migratory pathway and returned to the same foraging grounds off the west coast of Florida during all 4 times that she was tracked. And this repeated use through time indicates hardwiring of the turtles to specific behaviors and areas. Knowing when Kemp's Ridleys begin remigration is critical to understanding whether the Deepwater Horizon oil spill contributed to the decline in nesting during 2010. That is, after the spill began on April 20th, were some adult female Kemp's Ridleys harmed or killed in the foraging area in the Northern Gulf before they got the chance to remigrate to the nesting beach during 2010. There are only 3 published records and a handful of unpublished recent records of Kemp's Ridleys tracked from the foraging grounds to the nesting beaches. Again, because these PTTs generally do not last through the remigration interval. The first published record of an adult female Kemp's Ridley tracked from a foraging area to the nesting beach was Renault et al. 1996, where a turtle left the Northern Gulf foraging grounds in November, and that's the map on the left is from that publication. Now, our research group has tracked 3 turtles that remigrated from the Northern Gulf foraging grounds to the nesting beach. All 3 left the Northern Gulf foraging grounds in November or December. Turtle P12, which is the second one published at Shaver et al. 2016, was one of these 3 that remigrated from the Northern Gulf foraging grounds. Our group has also tracked 4 turtles that remigrated from the Southern Gulf foraging grounds to the nesting beach. And all 4 of these remigrants left the Southern Gulf foraging grounds in February or March. Turtle VC03 from Shaver et al. 2016, that's the third of the 3 published records, was one of those 4 that remigrated from the Southern Gulf foraging grounds. And this turtle was tracked remigrating twice. So based on satellite tracking data collected to date, remigration from the Northern Gulf may begin a few months earlier than from the Southern Gulf. And remigration appears to begin before the nesting season begins. And in 2010, nesting in Texas began on April 24th. And the tracking data collected to date support the hypothesis that turtles that were going to nest in 2010 had already left the Northern Gulf before the Deepwater Horizon spill began on April 20th. And thus the spill cannot be proven as a cause for the decline in nesting documented in 2010. However, that does not mean that there were not impacts to nesting from the spill during subsequent years. In the third of the areas that I'll discuss, internesting habitat, that's the third topic. And in Shaver et al. 2017, we attempted to quantify internesting habitat for and internesting movements of Kemp's Ridley turtles that were tracked from those 3 anchors in the nesting range, Padron National Seashore, Rancho Nuevo, and Tecolutla. Kemp's Ridleys lay an average of 2.5 to 3 clutches per nesting season, with an average of about 21 days between those clutches. And between nesting events, Kemp's Ridleys moved fairly widely, but their habitat use was primarily in grid cells closest to the nesting beach. During internesting, turtles used waters that were a mean of approximately 16 meters deep and 8 kilometers from shore. Thus, these waters were generally shallower and closer to shore than were the waters of the migratory corridor and the foraging areas. So for recommendations, we still have 24 of our PTTs transmitting. So we are still in the data collection and analysis phases of our research, and we still have more publications to do on these results that are planned, including more look at the foraging areas, considering this larger number of transmitters. We stress that continued monitoring of nest numbers and collection of biological data for nesting be conducted in Mexico and Texas, and those are needed for better understanding of the long-term trends and the causes for fluctuations in nest numbers. And we recommend continued protection of Kemp's Ridley turtles on the nesting beach, in the eggs, and of course protection of turtles in the marine environment to support the recovery efforts for this endangered species. And lastly, we must thank the field crews, excellent field crews in Mexico and Texas that helped locate the nesting turtles and deploy the PTTs on them. And we thank the organizations that funded the tracking studies, facilitated the work, helped analyze the data, and helped us with reporting. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Donna. All right, what I'd like to do right now is take a 15-minute break. So if everyone could be back promptly at 5 after 10, we would appreciate it so we can stay on time with everything. Thank you. All right, we're going to start back again, and our next presentation is going to be by Dr. Charles Calloway, and he's going to talk about pre-2010 evidence of declining Gulf of Mexico carrying capacity for Kemp's Ridley sea turtles.
Thanks, Jeff. Joe. I want to thank the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission for sponsoring this session, and especially to Jeff Rester, who invited us all to participate. It's a great opportunity, and it's appreciated. Next. This is the title, and I want to draw your attention to the fact that it's based on a published publication that's in Colonian Conservation and Biology. It was published in May this year, and it's open access. Anyone can go to the site and download it if you're interested in all the details. Next. According to Peter Pritchard in 2007, that was in Pam Plotkin's book on ridleys. Pam Plotkin is the director of the Texas Sea Grant Program. Pritchard pointed out, sort of in an introductory comments on Arabatas, that the rule of thumb in most marine turtle conservation programs is to protect nesting females and produce as many hatchlings as possible. The unspoken but unquestioned philosophy of most sea turtle conservationist, is that the more turtles, the better. And that's going to be kind of the theme of this presentation. Next. We've had many pictures of Kemp's Ridleys. This is the female, and these are the output, the reproductive outputs, the little hatchlings that are released each year. And that's been going on since 1966 without interruption. Every year, hatchlings are being produced down in Tamaulipas and other places. Next. Just a little background for Kemp's Ridley. As it was pointed out by Thane, it's a single species, and it's been around for 3 million or so years. That's quite a long time. And it's worth preserving just for that reason. It's the smallest of all the sea turtles. It has the smallest range of all the sea turtles. It's definitely in the Gulf of Mexico for the most part, but it also occurs in the North Atlantic Ocean all the way to the European coast. So that would be its geographic range. Now, the European coast is hostile habitat for Kemp's Ridley sea turtles. They're carried over there in the oceanic stage. Kemp's Ridley is classified as endangered throughout its range, and various of the speakers this morning have talked about the 18 June 1947 arribada that occurred at Rancho Nuevo. That has set the benchmark, as Thane said, for recovery of the species. Next. These are the Kemp's Ridley life stages. In any given year, there are eggs, and one cohort or year class of eggs and hatchlings is produced, and the hatchlings are released primarily from Tamaulipas. As pointed out earlier, the Tamaulipas nesting beaches produce the vast majority of Kemp's Ridleys. Thus, the production of hatchlings that leave the Tamaulipas beach dominate the demographics of the Kemp's Ridley population. The oceanics are surface pelagic immatures, which last anywhere from 1 to 4 years, I guess with an average of about 2 years. Those are the ones that are carried by surface circulation, not only within the Gulf of Mexico, but also outside the Gulf of Mexico. Every year you can expect some of those young turtles to leave the protections of the Gulf of Mexico. They eventually become neritic stages, meaning they live in the neritic or shallow water zones. They represent multiple cohorts. The immatures represent multiple cohorts, perhaps up to 6 to 8. The adults represent the most cohorts because they've been accumulated over years and years. And Galloway et al. Estimated that Kemp's Ridley individuals can live from anywhere from 50 to 100 years in the absence of human-caused mortality. Finally, sex ratios are predominantly females. They're dominated by females. And of course, there's been a lot of study of Kemp's Ridley sea turtle sex ratios, but from hatchlings all the way up to adults, they're mostly female. Next. There hasn't been much discussion of the roles, the ecological roles of Kemp's Ridleys in the Gulf of Mexico. And this represents on land as well as at sea. Kemp's Ridleys are preyed upon from hatchlings and eggs all the way up to adults. They also represent carrion because some, for example, are killed and stranded, and they either at sea or on beaches. They are predators, a top predator on oceanic and neritic invertebrates like crabs and other crustaceans, mollusks, etc. And they are scavengers. They also feed on discarded shrimp trawling bycatch, which has been substantially reduced by the use of TEDs and bycatch reduction devices. And then there are other ecological roles because turtles dig up the beach and so forth and so on. And all of this is explained in detail for sea turtles in general by Lovick et al. Next. The presentation today is really based on the hypothesis that the carrying capacity for the Kemp's Ridley population, and I would talk about, refer to the annual size of the Kemp's Ridley population in this context. The carrying capacity likely, very likely, has declined since 1947. And the paper that I cited earlier discusses all of the research findings from other papers that suggest a tremendous decline in Kemp's Ridley carrying capacity since 1947 to now. This degradation may have also affected Kemp's Ridley's food sources. Next. Kemp's Ridley, the Kemp's Ridleys that remain in the Gulf of Mexico contribute more to population growth for Kemp's Ridley than those that emigrate that are carried by ocean circulation, surface circulation into the North Atlantic Ocean. Most nesting obviously occurs on western Gulf of Mexico beaches. Each year, large numbers of these oceanic stage Kemp's Ridleys emigrate to the Atlantic. They don't swim there actively. They're carried there by currents. They have no choice. I believe this represents a net loss to the Kemp's Ridley population because there's very little evidence that any of these turtles return to the Gulf of Mexico. There is some evidence, and of course the lack of evidence is not proof of absence of Kemp's Ridleys returning back from the Atlantic to the Gulf of Mexico. But I think it can safely be said that that is a net loss to the population. If those turtles didn't escape the Gulf of Mexico, they probably contribute a lot more to Kemp's Ridley recovery. Nestings are rare on the U.S. East Coast. The latest one that I know of is one in June or July of this year in New York, on the coast of New York. And my guess is that has some relationship to global warming. Numbers in the North Atlantic Ocean that are marked there and are recaptured in the Gulf of Mexico are very limited. That's published by Cayo et al. In 2015. Another thing is that the migration distances from the western Gulf of Mexico to nesting beaches are a lot shorter than any migration distances involving turtles moving from the Atlantic to the Gulf of Mexico. Next. Kemp's Ridley Nestor Abundance Index Beach. This is the Kemp's Ridley Nesting Abundance Index Beach, and that's not all the nesting sites along the Tamaulipas coast, but it involves this little area here. And Jaime can tell you all the particulars about how big that area is and how it has changed somewhat over the years, but the importance of that is that this area is the zone where counts of adult nesters and hatchlings, both male and female hatchlings, occur each year. Also shown is the Deepwater oil spill site and Padre Island National Seashore and the Tecolootla nesting colony down in Veracruz. Next. For half a century, annual counts of nests and eggs laid have been maintained or registered for the index beach in Tamaulipas. During 1966 and 1977, a lot more clutches were left unprotected than those moved to on-beach hatcheries. On-beach hatcheries have included protected corrals, fenced-off corrals for the most part, but they are also, some of the clutches are moved to styrofoam boxes. I think that practice continues to this day, but only toward the end of the season or something. Am I correct there, Jaime, or there's no more kept in boxes?
It's rare. It still happens, but it's rare.
but very low, no numbers. During 1978 to 2018, most of the clutches that were found have been protected in on-beach hatcheries. So one of the reasons we have low numbers for nests and hatchlings releases in these years is because this was a startup of the program, and the resources available to protect nesters and hatchlings were limited compared to later years when the binational program became effective. During the nesting season, all of those nesting seasons from 1966 on, some nests aren't found. One can't find all of the nests, they find most of the nests. Next. Heppel et al. In 2007 emphasized that Kemp's Ridley population growth can only occur when births, that is, the hatchlings released, exceed deaths, and or immigration exceeds emigration. And the statement was made in that publication that emigration and immigration can be ignored because data are available for the entire species. Well, that means we have data for Kemp's Ridleys in the Atlantic and also in the Gulf of Mexico. But that doesn't mean we should ignore the fact that we're losing hatchlings and oceanic stage Kemp's Ridleys to the Atlantic every year. Let's see. Annual immigration from the Gulf of Mexico North Atlantic likely represents loss affecting growth and recovery of the geohem population. I mentioned that already. I want to emphasize that the population decline that started after 1947 reversed before there were any requirements for TEDs on shrimp boats. And because the minimum age at maturity for Kemp's Ridleys is somewhere around 10 years of age. It's not there's a lot of variability in age at maturity, but the minimum is around 10 years of age. That means that the hatchlings that were released from 1966 to 1976 were the ones that turned this population around in 1985. That's generally not, it's known about, but it's not emphasized enough. In other words, the efforts of Mexico in protecting eggs and hatchlings and nesters in 1966 to 1977 were the ones that turned the nesting, the decline around and saved the species from extinction. It would have gone to extinction probably sometime after 1985 had Mexico not started this program of protection. Later use of TEDs and declining shrimping effort for other reasons, primarily economic, those things accelerated the population growth as evidenced by the number of nests. Next. These are the demographic criteria for downlisting Kemp's Ridleys from endangered to threatened status. And those are established by the Binational Recovery Plan, which involves Mexico and the United States. At least 10,000 females nesting per season, that's equivalent to about 25,000 nests, and that is on the Nestor Abundance Index beach. That's why I refer to the Nestor Abundance Index beach in Tamaulipas all the time, because that is the index we use to follow the population changes. More interesting is that the recovery plan established this 300,000 hatchlings released per season as the minimum hatchling production to provide for Kemp's Ridley recovery. That level has been exceeded in all years 2000 to 2017, except for 2001 when it was just a little bit less than 300,000. Next. Then we have the nesting setback, and I refer to the nesting setback as occurring during all years from 2010 to 2018 because the predicted continued exponential increase of the population after 2009 was predicted by the recovery plan. It didn't happen, and the Nestor Abundance Index in Tamaulipas has remained more or less flatlined with wide variations, and we'll see that in the graphics I'll show you later. One big drop occurred in 2010, and I have here 35%, but again, that's for the Nestor Abundance Index beach, not for the whole beach, all of the beaches in Tamaulipas. And then we have wide variation during 2010 to 2018. There have been many hypotheses put forward since the setback, and none have been confirmed. Next. Okay, I'm showing the hatchling production graph first, the time series from 1966 to 2017. I would have liked to have plotted 2018 on there because there had been a lot of speculation as to whether it would exceed hatchling production, and that's also the case for nest, or it would be less than. It's substantially less than in 2018, and you can see this hatchling production generally was going down from its peak in 2009. This is the drop in 2010. Now, I've taken considerable liberty and just eyeballing a red line here showing what might have happened had the nesting setback not occurred. I'm going to later link the nesting setback to density-dependent slowing of growth in the population. So I just want to show what what would have been expected. There's 10 years difference between 2000 and 2010. That's the 2009 peak. Next. Oh, back that up if you would, please. I just want to emphasize, here's the limit placed back, the minimum numbers placed by the recovery plan. And you can see hatchling production has been far above that, especially in those 2010 and later years. Next. This is the annual nest trajectory. And again, I've taken the liberty to go from 2000 straight up, which would have been possibly the case had density-dependent factors not begun to affect the population and therefore the number of annual nests. You can see the downward trend here to 1985, and then almost a mirror image of an increase here, and it continued on through 2009, but this, you can see a little jog over to the right here, and then a general slowing of growth in the population. So the point I'm trying to make here is that populations can't grow exponentially forever. They eventually start being limited by carrying capacity of the environment for the species in question. And our paper in 2018 and this presentation suggests that carrying capacity is being approached starting in 2001. Next slide. Another indication of density-dependent effects is this decline in the number of hatchlings released per nest at the Nestor Abundance Index beach. From 1989, when the peak occurred, down to 2017, that annual hatchlings released per nest has been cut in half. And of course, that's going to affect how much effort you have to put in order to get a certain number of hatchlings. No one, to my knowledge, has explained why this takes place. I did not include the earlier years as I have in some of this graphs like this before. And the reason is because most of the nests were left in situ. They were not protected. So this all represents protected net. Next. In 2016, a number of us published a paper that used a novel approach for analysis. Instead of trying to relate annual numbers of hatchlings released to subsequent years nesting, we accumulated the numbers of hatchlings over the whole time series. So this is cumulative number of hatchlings, and you can see it's a nice smooth curve. Now, none of this is modeling. This is just connecting the dots. I want to emphasize that. This isn't a model. This is 13 million hatchlings released over all those years by 2017. And you can see 2010 in here. That was when the nesting setback began. And you can see that the trajectory would have gone up like this, but it kind of shifted off to the right. Next. Now this, I've put all of the different metrics on one graph using a log scale on the vertical axis. This is the cumulative numbers of hatchlings, representing the number of hatchlings ever released. And then these are the other metrics. Next. The model that was published in 2018 shows an exponential growth that would be assumed were that the correct kind of growth pattern. But this is a double logistic curve, and you can see there's a lot of variation in nests after 2000. Well, it's showing about 2004. Another metric we're using is the year-to-year change or growth rate in number of nests. Next. I've taken out this year-to-year change in growth rate. This line would represent no change in growth from year to year. Points below the graph indicate drops in nests in consecutive years, and these represent increases in nests in consecutive years. And you can see the peak in year 2000. That was when the population was growing at the greatest rate. Next. This is for hatchlings to hatchlings, the same kind of graph. Again, those indicate increases. These dots underneath the line of 1 represent decreases. And again, 2000 stands out as an important point where growth of the population changed. Next. This is a plot of the numbers of nests 10 years later divided by the number of nests. So that's the rate of growth. Can I continue? That's the rate of growth in the population, in the number of nests with a 10-year time lag. And that's what you would expect with a cumulative hatchlings eventually affecting the number of nests. And you can see this slowing of the rate, again, a kind of a sigmoid curve, and then a big drop. In other words, that's way below what you would, after 2010, the rate of growth is way below what you would expect from the cumulative hatchlings released in prior years. Next. These are just mentioned that there are a number of other signs that there was declining or increasing density dependence in the population after 2000. These are additional pre-2010 signs of increase in density dependence effects on the number of nests. And that's all previously published. Next. Possible contributors to declining carrying capacity. Long-term degradation of the Gulf of Mexico ecosystem And this can be checked out by all the publications that have been done on decline in the Gulf of Mexico ecosystem. Increased Kemp's Ridley abundance during 86 to 2009. In other words, we're getting so many turtles, they're competing with one another for food resources. There's a decline in per capita availability of food, and that comes from natural prey as well as discarded bycatch from shrimp trawling. A lot of things compete for the same foods with both neritic and adult Kemp's Ridleys. Lots of fish predators eat the same things. There's competition with the crab fishery and perhaps other fisheries. Insufficient nesting areas, I don't think is a problem at the present time, because Kemp's Ridleys are spreading out in their nesting areas. Next. The population in 47 obviously had more nesters than currently. Population may have been smaller or larger than the current population. We have no idea, because we're using nests as the measure of population size. Attainment of population age structure similar to the one in 1947 may be a more realistic goal for recovery than using the number of nests or the number of nesting females. By age structure, I mean the numbers of Kemp's Ridleys in each age group over time. So the question is, how can we reach such an age structure? I think the bottom line is that we may have more young Kemp's Ridleys in the neritic life stages than we need in order to maximize the number of adult females. This is going to be highly controversial, and I'll leave it with that.
Thank you, Charles. We enjoyed the presentation. Our next presenter is Dr. Brian Wallace, and he is not here, but through the miracle of modern technology, he will be giving his presentation from Colorado. And he is going to be talking about Deepwater Horizon oil spill impacts to Kemp Ridley sea turtles. So.
Thanks, Jeff. Can everybody hear me okay?
You bet.
If you're nodding, I can't hear you.
We can hear you loud and clear, Brian, so go ahead.
Excellent. Okay, great. All right, and I just wanted to test there that the slides are advancing for me, and it looks like they are. So thanks to Joe for forming that miracle of modern technology. Thanks to Jeff and the organizers for inviting me to participate. It's quite a lineup, so I'm pretty lucky to be listed among various folks who've already presented or will present in this particular session. So what I'm going to talk about now, following up on Charles's presentation, which I really enjoyed as well, is to zoom in on a particular incident that I'm sure looms large in the memories of everybody sitting in the room there, and that's the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So I was asked to give kind of a summary of the effects identified through the natural resource damage assessment by the natural resource trustees. And just as by way of background, when I refer to trustees, I'm referring to those federal and state agencies that were official natural resource trustees on behalf of you all, on behalf of the American public, and under U.S. federal law. And I'll walk through this process a little bit. We're charged with identifying and quantifying the effects on natural resources that are held in the public trust, and then to seek restoration compensation for those losses. And so that's kind of the brief background here of what I'm going to be sharing with you all today. And I want to mention here that even though it's my voice you hear, there were a lot of people who were involved actually for much longer even than I was, from the day of the spill through the settlement itself. And I just want to acknowledge that what I'll be presenting is really a summary of the work of lots of different people. And that's a pretty important thing to emphasize. And speaking of which, I just want to take a second to put up some names of agencies and people who were highly involved in this process, particularly on the injury assessment, which is where I'm going to focus the rest of the time on here. The Sea Turtle Technical Working Group that was part of the NRDA, and in particular, Dr. Brian Stacy and Barbara Schroeder, who really led the charge from day one of the spill through the settlement. Okay, apologies if things lag a little bit. I'll sort of talk through as we go. So again, just as by way of background, not that we necessarily want to relive those days or the scope and the magnitude of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, but it bears repeating or reminding that this was really an unprecedented environmental catastrophe by almost any measure. The oil spilled freely for almost 3 months after the rig exploded, April 20th, 2010. It also happened about a mile under the surface of the water and 50 miles offshore. So it was very deep and remote from where most shoreline-based resources are located. At the maximum extent of the surface footprint, so that's to say nothing of the deep water plume, it was roughly the size of Switzerland. So because of these just sort of baseball card stats, if you will, that summarize just how big and complex the spill was, it merited an unprecedented scale and types of response and then assessment across the entire area and duration of the spill. It's important context to keep in mind. And among those things, it was somewhat unique to a marine oil spill and then having to both respond, that is, rescue wildlife, clean up the oil as it's spilling or before it comes to shore and causes even more damage, but then also to perform the actual assessment of effects. One major challenge, of course, was that remote offshore location of the rig itself, or the source of the spill. And so, as everybody knows, as we look out into the blue of the Gulf of Mexico, you get your classic weed lines, the pelagic sargassum, which provides habitat for lots of different species, including multiple sea turtle species in the Gulf and in the North Atlantic. So this is what, if you were out in the blue in 2009, the year before the spill, you came across a weed line, this is maybe what it would look like. And then in basically the same kind of place, the same kind of habitat in 2010, this is what it would look like. And so pretty immediately, emergency responders and the Protected Resources Division of NOAA recognized the spill posed a unique and acute threat to life stages sea turtles that typically maybe isn't considered under threat to from things like oil spills, which are typically closer to shore and maybe smaller in scope. That is because of the way sargassum and other floating debris and organisms that depend on those habitats tend to be aggregated within convergence zones. Oil would be aggregated in those places as well. And so even though it's a really big ocean, when lots of things are converged in the same place, and one of those things is toxic to the biota in the system, that poses a unique threat. So this was something that the trustees recognized very, very early on. But of course, even though the source of the spill was far from shore, the fact that the spill lasted for almost 3 months, I should say the free release period of the spill, that is before the gusher was finally stopped, continued for that long, it means that, of course, a lot of oil made it to shore, as all of you know. So this is just a schematic to give a sense of where and how sea turtles might have been exposed to oil. And the answer is everywhere. Across ecological realms, inhabited by different life stages. Charles just summarized for us nicely, so I don't have to go into too much detail. Everywhere from those open ocean surface pelagic habitats for small juveniles to the continental shelf and aridic areas inhabited by large juveniles and adults, all the way to shorelines and nesting beaches. And this is, of course, here generally for all sea turtle species, but of course we will talk specifically about Kemp's as we go. So with that kind of context, now what? There needed to be an emergency response, and then of course the damage assessment itself. But again, I just want to emphasize here, because of the challenges, which were of course monumental and unprecedented, presented by this spill, it merited it called for a very different approach, kind of an all hands on deck and everything in the kitchen sink kind of approach to assess the effects. But first, of course, the primary mission during response in the early days of the assessment was to save turtles and other resources, of course. Here we're talking about turtles in particular, but there were incredible efforts by a lot of people in emergency response in the early days of the assessment for lots of natural resources. Then once there's sort of the emergency side of things is underway, then of course, this being a natural resource damage assessment, the secondary mission is to estimate those total, in this case, turtle exposures and injuries. And the injury part, of course, is a legal term that just means how many died, or how many could we demonstrate adverse effects under the existing legislation. So I'm just going to very briefly give you a sense of how the NRDA is set up. And so this is a relatively prescribed process that is defined by federal law. Once this process is triggered, then there are certain steps that the trustees and the responsible party, in this case, BP, would take collaboratively. So first is demonstrating exposure to oil, then demonstrating the adverse effects of that exposure that is then translated to injury. And then once injury is quantified, coming up with on the other side of the ledger, just how much the damages in the legal terms refers to money, basically. It refers to the compensation needed to implement a restoration plan that will restore that resource one-to-one back to the way it was before the spill occurred. So quantify the injury, then quantify what you need to do to restore for that injury. That's NRDA in a nutshell. So in the case of sea turtles, mortality, that is the number of dead turtles, was the key metric of injury. There can be others, and I don't want to go into that too much, so maybe save that for discussion if it's interesting to anybody. But in our case, counting or estimating number of dead turtles was a key metric of injury, and therefore also then the key metric on the other side of the equation, that is for restoration. And so to quantify mortality, we undertook a suite of veterinary-based assessments, and tox-based assessments that were informed by information collected from a whole suite of different techniques, everything from the field-based observations, which I'll talk about a little bit more, clinical and necropsy data, chemical analyses, tox data, and of course some statistical approaches to estimating the full scope and nature of exposure and injury. So again, the key question here, how many sea turtles died? That was our charge. So to give kind of a quick summary here, and I'm going to peel back a few of these layers just a little bit to give you a better sense of what we had to work with. Because of the way that response had to occur, and then the way that assessments had to occur, we ended up with sort of two different cases almost, or maybe a better way to put it was that we tried to quantify that overall sea turtle mortality by life stage, because the types of information that we were collecting, the types of methods we were using were so different. It made sense to keep these on sort of parallel tracks and then to combine them in the end to some extent. So surface pelagic, of course, most recovered as live and oiled individuals rescued by response vessels, whereas neuretic juveniles and adults, where they were directly observed, it was more as dead, stranded, and non-oiled carcasses, in fact. But then also the presence was detected by aerial surveys. I'll talk about a little bit more. So to document exposure, we had direct documentation, as I mentioned, and here's directed captures. These were boat-based response vessels going out into the weed lines and looking for little turtles, and then rescuing them and assessing the degree of oiling. Of course, also surveillance for stranded turtles. So these were direct documentation. Some alternative approaches where we couldn't get hands on animals. So think of big neuritic turtles that spend 95% of their lives below the surface of the water, so not easy to catch, at least in meaningful numbers given logistical constraints. Here's where aerial surveys came in to at least document the presence of those animals and estimate the density and abundance within the spill area. And then, of course, remote sensing of the oil spill footprint itself, and that's that figure there in the bottom right. Synthetic aperture radar, in other words, daily snapshots of the extent of the oil footprint on the surface of the water. This turns out to be extremely important as we stitch back together all the different pieces of the assessment. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So to give you a sense here, all these dotted lines are the tracks of response vessels going out looking for little turtles in weed lines or out in the blue to try to rescue them and collect information on them. So these efforts occurred out of 3 different ports. They're labeled there, and between May and September of 2010. I want to emphasize here that these boat-based rescue operations, in addition to being, of course, quite taxing and arduous for those who were performing the surveys themselves, turned out to be absolutely bedrock to the overall sea turtle injury assessment. You can sort of see there right in front of the dip net through the mousse of surface oil, those little knobs are on the carapacial ridge of a little Kemp's. So this was unfortunately a somewhat common sight to rescue these little turtles from being trapped in the surface soil. So in particular, what these boat-based assessments gave us were direct observations of the extent of physical fouling or external oiling on animals. So here, and then based on the post-processing of photographs taken by vets and the response crew in situ, we're able to categorize the extent of oiling into different categories. Minimal, light oiling, moderate oiling, and heavy oiling. You can probably guess which is which in these cases. In addition, the response folks were also able to quantify the number of those animals that had evidence of ingested oil, that is, in the upper oral cavity or upper esophagus. And those percentages correspond to the number of animals in each of those oiling categories that were also observed to have ingested oil. Of course, increases with the extent of external oiling. And to give you a sense of the variation in what that might have looked like, here you have a heavily oiled turtle to the left and a minimally or lightly oiled turtle up in that right corner. And then, of course, what the inside of a dead turtle's esophagus looks like once it's ingested a lot of oil. So summarizing here what was done in the injury assessment, again, as I mentioned, as part of the veterinary evaluation, these animals that were rescued were taken into rehab. And I should mention that with dedicated veterinary care, nearly all of the animals, regardless of their oiling extent when they were encountered, survived and were released later. So with intervention, and as many of us know, turtles are pretty hardy and tended to respond well and survived the treatment. So collected a whole suite of information from those animals for clinical diagnoses. Also performed a surrogate laboratory exposure study to get a sense of the potential adverse toxicological effects of ingesting oil. And we used, when I say surrogate, we used freshwater turtle species, of course, because of the endangered status of sea turtles, prevented us from being able to do such a study on sea turtle species. I'm not going to talk about the nesting side of things too much, or the beach-based side of things, but I'm happy to punt that to discussion later. But we also looked at analysis of nesting activity within the response area, that is nesting deterrence potentially caused by oil spill response. And then, of course, there was the relocation of nests under imminent threat from the Gulfs to the Atlantic side. So the key findings of the injury assessment, really physical fouling was the thing that we had the most evidence of adverse effects on, especially the surface pelagic juvenile sea turtles, most readily apparent immediate threat to oiled sea turtles. As far as clinical findings, there were some anomalies. There were some, as the vets refer to them, hemodynamic and metabolic derangements in some of the clinical diagnoses, the clinical indicators, but these were not consistently indicative of any degree of oil exposure, and potentially confounded, in fact, by capture and transport from where they were rescued to the rehab facilities. Few direct observations in Riddick turtles, as mentioned before. Of course, we wouldn't expect them to be out in the weed line where we're finding the little turtles. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, in habitat that's more likely to have Riddick turtles, aerial surveys were the primary mode of data collection. Just to touch on strandings for a second, though, since I mentioned Riddick turtles that would be more likely to turn up in strandings records, most of the strandings concurrent with the spill were Riddick juvenile Kemp's Ridleys. However, very few had any evidence of oil exposure or dispersion exposure, and that's by direct observation as well as some chemical analyses of tissues of animals that could be sampled. The strandings occurred as kind of the typical seasonal pulses in spring and summer months, and then also continued in the years after the spill. And those animals that could be necropsied were generally characterized by good nutritional condition and lack of any signs of poor health or disease. Many, in fact, had fed on fish prior to, probably just prior to dying. So now, as I'm rounding third here, I want to walk through then that's exposure and then how we determine injury. Now I want to get to the quantification. So piecing all of the puzzle pieces together, we were able to generate estimates of density from the surface pelagic life stage, that is from the boat-based surveys. We could estimate density of neritic juveniles and adults from the aerial surveys. So we could generate numbers of animals that were potentially within the spill zone. Then based on the veterinary and toxicological assessments, we were able to assign mortality probabilities to the different extents of oiling, if you remember those categories that I showed before. And then, of course, we needed a way to, because we were only directly observing a sample of all the turtles that were within the spill zone during the entire, throughout the spill area and during the period of the spill, we needed to come up with a way to model that severity or that probability of heavy oiling in particular over time and space to get at the full extent and nature of the injuries. And so on the next slide here, I'm going to show an animation that shows daily footprints of the probability of heavy oiling. That is that worst category, if you remember. And what we did here was, because we had direct observations on the little turtles, we were able to statistically, we were able to create a statistical model that allowed us to look at the time and the area prior to that turtle being captured and relate the surface oiling footprints in that time and in that area to the capture location to come up with a statistical estimate of the probability that animal, depending on the oil scenario that it had seen, would have been a heavily oiled animal. And then once we were able to do that for the small turtles for which we actually had direct observations of oiling probability, we were able to take that model and apply it to the larger turtles that we couldn't directly observe, but we knew their oil history because we knew where they had been sighted, so we could run the same model on them. Then we expanded that same statistical approach to the entire oil footprint. So without further ado here, maybe I'll just go ahead and click to it. What you'll see here is we're going to have all on the same place. We're going to have the aerial survey animals, the directed capture animals, and the oil spill footprint itself. And I'm going to show you here, if I can get it to, whoops, sorry about that. Let me just take us back one. Sometimes my cursor on this end is a little slower than the cursor on that end. So what you're going to see as we get this, will get going. Sorry about that. I'm just going to let it run. You're going to see the extent, of course, of the Northern Gulf. I want you to notice in the bottom left of the map will be the dates. So the animation will go day by day. And you'll get a sense then from the initiation of the spill how that probability of heavy oiling occurs. Yeah, go ahead and we can play it. This is just a quick text description of the animation that went with the publication. And by the way, if on this particular piece, this was published in Endangered Species Research last year, along with a lot of other papers on the turtle and mammal injury assessments. Right, so the gray area is the extent of the footprint overall. And what you're going to see is there's those triangles, the aerial survey animals that are observed. The hexagons that come in a little closer to the wellhead, of course, are going to be your directed capture animals. Note that those that were boat-based collected don't occur until mid-May. So the first month of the spill, there weren't rescue efforts that were able to be mounted. So you can keep that in mind when you think about the estimation of the entire injury. And so as you can see, now we're about a month and a half in. The purple area is the highest probability of heavy exposure. that's expanded away from the wellhead, and now it's even some of those lower probabilities have reached shore by mid-June. Those spots are the hexagons and the triangles are actual turtle locations. I want to emphasize that. And then the color they correspond to are, of course, their probability of heavy oiling based on the model that I described before. So this is just to give you a sense of how things changed in space and time as the spill progressed. As we now get into mid-July, the well is finally capped. So you'll see those purple areas begin to diminish because finally oil is no longer freely flowing. And so the probabilities are derived from surface oil that is now, that's still in the environment, basically. You'll see also that some of the directed capture efforts are now occurring up in the northeast there, going towards the panhandle. That was meant, of course, to sample the entire area to the extent possible, but now it's later in the spill and further away from where the wellhead was. You'll see those are low probability of heavy oiling. And we only had these satellite-based remotely sensed oil footprint data through early August, hence the reason the animation stops here. So how does this all wrap up then? That's how we tied everything together, and then we're able to estimate the full nature and extent of injuries. Now, this table shows you how the totals turned out. The columns are the different species. The rows are by life stages. So if we zoom in on Kemp's for a second, of course, this was the species, at least numerically, was affected the most, or had the highest number of mortalities that we were able to document, especially that surface pelagic stage, which isn't surprising given where the spill occurred and for how long it was occurring. So to put this in context, we estimated somewhere between 36,000 and 90,000 surface pelagic juveniles that were killed. So what does this actually mean in a population context? So I want to mention here what I'm going to zip through are illustrations, not the products of really robust population modeling, but rather illustrations to give us a sense, almost that to ground truth in a sense our estimates, or I should say to make sure they actually made some reasonable sense. And so these aren't meant to say to implicate any actual population level impacts. In fact, we don't need to demonstrate that under the NRDA. We just need to document injury to merit restoration. So the total estimates of surface pelagics on the high end, we're talking about maybe 10 to 20% of all the 1 and 2 year old Kemps alive in the Northern Gulf at the time of the spill. That's what that number means there. For the neritics, the larger juveniles and adults, this came out to something like 400 to maybe 600 nesting females, or something like maybe 10% of the entire adult nesting female population. That's looking at an average across multiple years of estimated nesters. And then on the hatchling side of things, again, here this is if we carried forward how many adults and subadults might have been removed by the 2010 event, and then that impact on what we might have seen or expected on the nesting beaches in subsequent years. We're talking about maybe 3% of the cumulative losses. And here what I mean is, going back to Charles's presentation, if we estimated the number of nests that we would have expected had the population continued on an exponential increase versus the number of nests actually documented, that difference, only about 3% of that difference may have been accounted for by lost nests, given the nesting females and subadults that would have maybe recruited into the adult population in those subsequent years. So summing up here, heavy oiling, as I mentioned, particularly as observed as external physical oiling, represented a grave threat to survival. Without intervention, the trustees asserted that especially those surface pelagic juveniles would have died without intervention if they were heavily oiled. And as I mentioned, this was a major piece of the overall injury assessment. Unsurprisingly, given that strandings are a relatively poor indicator of overall dynamics and magnitude of mortality, few carcasses of oiled turtles were recovered, and there's lots of reasons why there would have been a reduced probability of discovery. We can talk about those, although many folks are probably already familiar with why that is. Intervention was highly successful. So a lot of turtles were rescued, and as I mentioned, they responded very well to clinical intervention. However, of course, the number that could be rescued was very different to the number that perhaps needed rescue because of the size and the duration of the spill. So overall, what this experience gave us, even though we generated a wealth of information on oil spill effects on sea turtles in general, and lots of other natural resources, by the way, we still need a better understanding, for example, of chronic and delayed and sublethal effects. Physical effects certainly seem to be acute and potentially lethal in lots of cases. However, those sublethal exposures on other factors like growth and reproduction, we largely don't know about. And this is an area for further investigation for sure. And to end on maybe a somewhat positive note here, of course, the settlement means that we ended up with a lot of money dedicated to restoration of natural resources in the Northern Gulf. That might be familiar with this table. This comes from the Programmatic Damage Assessment and Restoration Plan, or the PDARP, associated with Deepwater Horizon. The columns are the different trustee implementation groups, or TIGs, so at the state level as well as federal TIGs. And then the rows are the different natural resources to which money has been allocated. And just to zoom us in here on sea turtles, of course, as many folks know, there's a lot of early restoration work already going on. And there's a lot of long-term restoration planning and implementation that's getting stood up by multiple TIGs right now. So there are going to, in the next 12 to 15 years, there's going to be a lot of resources put on the ground to restore for this injury and make all of us, the public, whole for the losses of natural resources that we all suffered as a result of the spill. And I realize now that this is a lie, of course. Questions we'll wait for on the back end. But thanks very much for your attention, and thanks again to Jeff and the organizers for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Brian. We appreciate the presentation. Last but not least, we have Dr. Benny Galloway, and he's going to talk about the need for a new stock assessment workshop for Kemp's Ridley.
Thank you. Well, like the others, I would like to thank you for inviting me here. I'm quite honored to be on this panel of sea turtle biologists. I came into the world of sea turtle biology from the dark side. My job, how I got involved, was estimating shrimp trawl bycatch of sea turtles and the effects on the population size. And that used to be a very contentious issue. And so I met a lot of sea turtle biologists, and actually we became friends. And we tried to reach consensus on what the effects were and the population level effects. And that led to an invitation or a contract from the commission to do a sea turtle stock assessment in 2012 and 13. So we got to know each other a lot better, and we all learned a lot, I think, from each other. So I'd like to build on that experience. When sea turtle conservation began, there was really limited biological data available to guide the conservation efforts. And here you've heard some of these names, but I'd like to add another name, Rene Marquez. I think he did more to educate me on Kemp's Ridley because he wrote an early monograph. And so I studied that, and surprisingly, what he wrote way back when still holds true today. So he was a very knowledgeable person. And it became quickly obvious that the solution, in part, was to maximize reproductive output to counter the substantial losses resulting from bycatch and harvest of turtles. I'll get this down. So the idea was, here is a generalized life history schematic for sea turtle. The citation for who prepared the graphic is there. And basically it just says, you get adults converging on the mating grounds for Kemp Ridley, near the natal beaches, depositing eggs, and protecting hatchlings. So in this part of their life history, they're accessible to humans, and they're available or subject to a lot of threats, including things like birds and hurricanes and beach modifications and people living in the area, tourists in some areas. I'm combining the range from Texas to Tampa. I know you probably don't have a lot of tourists down there, Jaime, but I know Donna does. You got to get the trucks off the cars off the beaches, incidentally. So, but and also, I think occasionally one or two adults were eaten. So that's why I've got the butcher knife there, showing that, showing that they might have been harvested. And then when you get up here, I'm already out of time. The other threats include things like, again, birds, and I bet you can't tell what that one is. That's a light. That's supposed to be a light pole, with the lights interfering with the migration to the beach. And I got a dollar mark on that little guy. It should be the dollar mark on the eggs, that's what was harvested. So those are the things that threaten the life stages at that time. And if you're looking at protecting those life stages, you can reduce many of those sources of anthropogenic mortality simply by having people on the beach doing what these people have been describing that they do. So I don't know if you noticed in the previous slide, you're supposed to subtly see that these arrows get bigger as we protect them, but it's not too clear. So anyway, we protect those on the beaches, and the bottom line is to fulfill the premise that the more hatchlings that are produced, the better. We've got to get more hatchlings into the system to offset the losses, and that was the goal, and that's what the goal should have been at that particular point of time. The question I'd like to speak to is, what do we do when the crisis has been averted? I mean, obviously it was near extinction, and now I think at worst it's not near extinction. I'm not sure where it is, but it's a long way from where it was. But the idea is, where do we need to go when we get past this crisis stage with managing the population? I use this reference to show sea turtle trends and other populations around the world. And if these are sea turtle nesting populations, and if the symbol is green, that suggests an increasing trend. You can see, LK is the Kemp's Ridley, the greens and loggerheads, etc. So where populations are increasing in many areas of the world, and at some point, as long as they are increasing, at some point, density-dependent effects will eventually become a management concern. More turtles can result, well, inevitably, it will result in reduced per capita food availability. And that, as you know, could result in reduced individual growth rates, reduced body condition, increased susceptibility to natural stressors, increased time to sexual maturity, reduced fecundity, etc. All of these are common effects. For Kemp's Ridley, it's some attributes about Kemp's Ridley. Its attributes of mass nesting behavior, precise natal homing, and restricted geometry of the Gulf of Mexico results in a spatial and temporal distribution of conspecifics right there in the Gulf, which may exacerbate the potential for density-dependent effects. And Nathan has already presented some of his work, and you see these are predicted distribution of Kemp's Ridleys. And based on the relative proportion of hatchlings dispersing from each of the nesting sites, as he described earlier, and modeled using dispersal based on ocean currents. Each panel represents a different cohort of turtle, and you can see that they extend from 2003 to 2010. And the color in this case represents the relative density of virtual turtles, I suppose, during the first 1.5 years of their oceanic migration. And they're scaled, and simply The red means a lot of turtles, the green is much less, and the blue is hardly any. So the idea is that during this first year and a half, they are mostly restricted to the Gulf of Mexico. So that's the density, it's a small body of water. If we look at some of the other species, I think I got off. Other species, their distributions extend across entire ocean basins. They're not restricted to the Gulf of Mexico. They're spread over much larger geographic areas, so their potential for density dependent effects might be less. So the biological traits that you've heard described for Kemp's Ridley are consistent with a species that is likely to experience strong density dependent selection. When food is limited, natural selection is likely to favor individuals that mature and reproduce at smaller sizes and at younger ages. And compared to the other sea turtles, Kemp's Ridley has the shortest duration of the oceanic stage. They have the smallest size at maturity and are the youngest at sexual maturity. So the question is, at what point, which this is, should we transition from crisis management, that is maximizing production of recruits, to population management, where we consider numerical abundance as well as aspects of population resilience? We're trying to maximize both features. When do we do that? Well, first of all, you have to know what the population is doing. So here's what the Kemp's Ridley population is doing. These are based on the nest count at the index beaches. So, and what we do when we have data like that to determine what the population is doing, and I'm poking fun at myself as well as my colleagues here, so don't take it personally. We all have an idea. These are all the same data sets. We all have an idea as to what is the most appropriate model for describing that data set and what the population is doing. And you can see it, this fella, hey, it's a simple linear regression. No, it's quadratic. No, it's logarithmic. It's tapering off, or it's growing uncontrollably. Or I have a theory the data doesn't quite fit it, but I can divide it into two parts and it works. No, that's too complex. We'll just smooth the lines. Everybody has an idea, but the main thing you don't want to do is predict beyond the limits of your data, because you're going to be wrong. We had a 19% exponential increase. It was going to go on forever. It didn't. Well, it went down from the BP oil spill and other things probably, and it's going to come back and resume its growth in a few years. It didn't. It's jogging around. So what is it doing? We're not real sure. The next question is, why is it doing whatever it's doing that we don't know? When nest counts were increasing, we assumed that everything was going just fine, and we didn't really need to know the why. It was just it's growing. It's good. We're doing good. Now that we have a highly variable set of circumstances, we're confronted with a problem. And what that problem is when you stop and think about it, is that nest counts by themselves actually tell you surprisingly little about what a population of sea turtles is doing. We know something has changed, but we don't know what it is or what it might be. And there are several factors that could be put forward and defended that would probably account for the situation. So we look at Kemp's Ridley. Folks like Carr and Marquez and Pritchard said, actually you can tell a lot if you know the clutch frequency, the number of nests laid by an individual turtle within a nesting season, and the remigration interval. How often do they come back and lay these 2 or 3 nests? Based on the data Dr. Shaver has been gathering, they have consistent long-term mark recapture program, and you can address these issues right now in part. Here is the trend of number of nests for females. It doesn't look like in Texas it's quite 2.5. And you look at later data where you have good sample sizes, the remigration interval is also increased in recent years. The Rancho Nuevo program was fortunate in that the commission funded a mark recapture study for 2 years, enabling the application of marks, the surveying of turtles, a dedicated team to do the mark recapture. But that funding has dried up. So you heard Jaime say that they will continue to try to monitor for tags, but they won't be putting on new tags. And that work, I suggest, is critical to getting at the answer of what we should be doing with future management, and we're not doing it. So that comes down to my thoughts as to what needs to be done. And we all have a great time fitting curves, and it's fun, and we can fit it in. But what we need to do is forget about focusing on the curves and start focusing on the mechanisms that are controlling the fluctuations in trends. And to understand trends and variability in population status, we need some basic biological data and a robust modeling approach. We need to determine variability in the remigration interval clutch frequency and whether they vary by turtle age. That is, what are the effects of the age structure of the population having? And that is strongly dependent on a major tagging program at the primary nesting beach that needs to be done. We need a better understanding of the spatial ecology of the turtles in Tamaulipas. What are the environmental conditions they experience, and what proportion of the population uses different regions of the Gulf? What are the triggers to the remigration intervals? Will a really cold winter change the timing of the migration interval? And I think we had the most success, in my opinion, when we brought together this and other experts from Mexico and actually throughout the United States and even the world into a workshop setting to reach consensus on some of these issues and to evaluate and test the various ideas that might account for these fluctuations. For example, we've previously published a model that incorporates shrimping effort into the Kemp's Ridley population model. The key finding of that work was shrimping-induced mortality was highly unlikely to be accounting for the apparent shifts. We are all poised to update that effort. And what I'm calling for, and what I think is important, is I think it's time to have another assessment workshop. And no one wants to fund an assessment workshop. It's not very fun and exciting, but I think it's desperately needed. And because regardless where the Kemp's Ridley population is right now, they have aspects of their life history that continues to make them vulnerable to extinction. And they're slow to mature, they have a complex life cycle that has widely separated in different habitats, and they have restricted reproductive grounds. So regardless of the numerical abundance at any point in time, they must be carefully managed and protected because they can always have a reversal. And to ensure that the management approaches we are taking are most beneficial to the species, we need a robust statistical mechanistic population model to be developed and utilized and evaluated. We can't just keep fitting curves and each coming up with our explanation. We need to know what the population is doing and why it's doing it. And that leads to defining the best management options for ensuring that growth and ability to withstand insult is maximized. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, Benny. We appreciate that. And actually, I want to go ahead and thank all the speakers again for presenting here. As the facilitator, you made my job very easy. I had people agreeing to be a speaker before I even contacted them, and had speakers contacting me. So it made my job very simple, and I appreciate all the effort that y'all have put into this and showing up here and making this morning very worthwhile. I've learned a lot. So thanks to everyone. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to transition. We're going to bring the entire panel up here, and we're going to have our question and answer session. So if you have questions during the presentations, now is your time to ask them. We have a microphone right there so our online viewers can hear. For the speakers themselves, please come over here and sit at the table. What you're going to need to do is press the button on the microphone. The red light will light up, and while you're speaking, and after you're done with that, please click the button off. They're leaving. That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. So, do we have any questions from the audience? And Brian, are you still online?
You bet. And I just turned on my webcam, unfortunately for everyone who can see.
All right, so we do have Brian. He's still there. If you had any questions about any of the NERDA work or the impacts on sea turtles from the oil spill, he's there also.
I'm Chris Nelson. I represent the dark side that Benny worked with, the Gulf shrimping industry, and just to and I, I'm saying that sarcastically. I didn't consider us the dark side. Obviously, I still work for my family business, but we did contribute a tremendous amount of blood, sweat, and tears and treasure to, we hope, make this possible, the recovery of the Kemp's Ridley, or to the extent that it is recovered so far. And this is a comment and a question. I have told, there was a demonstration, a very infamous demonstration in Galveston Bay some years ago, where the shrimpers blockaded Galveston Bay, and we got a 6-month reprieve from having to implement the TEDs. And my two comments on that were, number one, the TED actually was a tremendous gift to the industry, and that it allowed us to continue to shrimp. And I've told shrimpers that, and I continue to tell them that. So you can complain about it all you want, but without the TED, we would have probably not been able to continue to shrimp. It's somewhat debatable, but I think it's relatively, I think everybody would agree to that, outside of maybe a few shrimpers. So there's that, and there's the fact that if you really wanted to demonstrate against something, I think the one aspect that has still not been completely, the aspect of turtles in general, I don't know if it really applies to the Kemps, since so many of them nest in an area that is, as far as I know, being fairly well protected, is the lighting issue that Benny brought up. And I missed some of the rest of the talks, so if the rest of you talked about this, forgive me. But I think we still have inadequately addressed the effects of beach lighting on, and what that's doing to a lot of different turtle populations. And I'll talk about my area in Gulf Shores, Orange Beach, Alabama. There's, I think, that the tourism agencies would probably crucify me for saying it, but I'll say it publicly. There's some token efforts to address that, but it's inadequate, as well as keeping the tourists away from the nests. That's, the more interest there is in turtle restoration, the more interest there is from tourism, and so there's that to be addressed. Anyway, if I've told shrimpers, if they want to protest, and back when we were thinking about protesting against the TED, I said, if you want to protest against something, go lie down on the bridge that crosses the Intracoastal Waterway going over to Gulf Shores and Orange Beach, and don't let the tourists come. That'll protect the turtles better than you guys not putting TEDs in your nets. So my question is, if you'll forgive all that editorializing, is to what extent did all those contributions, how would we rank those? And I hope that the implementation of the TED and the net, would be a high ranking contribution, but I also know that protecting the nesting beach in Rancho Nuevo particularly, which by the way was funded at least in part by some of the shrimp organizations and the commercial fishing community, how well that contributed to, or to what extent that contributed to the recovery of the species. Thanks for letting me comment and ask.
I'd like to respond to that because that's been a good question I've been asking for decades. With the modeling we are doing, I believe there may be a way of parsing out the contribution that TEDs have made to this trajectory and nest over the years in comparison to what introduction of hatchlings has contributed to population growth. It hasn't been done yet. It should have been done by now. I hope we should do it in the future.
I'd like to quote Wilma Anderson, who many of you may know. She was head of the Texas Shrimp Association for many years, and a few years before her death, she told me, said, Benny, if we were allowed to do away with TEDs entirely, I would strongly advocate that we not do it. It's been the best thing that's happened to this industry. And the combination of TEDs properly used, which is getting better and better each year, thanks to some pretty good enforcement, but it's better and better. Shrimp trawl bycatch has been reduced as a factor. It would not rank high in today's world as a factor. It's much, gone from the proverbial, I forget how many tens of thousands down to less than a few thousand total turtles. So it has made a huge contribution, and it's very valuable. How it's relative. Does it mean I have to be quiet? Its relative contribution has been large, but the infusion of hatchlings, without that, it wouldn't have mattered whether we had TEDs or not. We would not have Kemp's Ridleys today. But the combination of the two is extremely important from all the analyses I have done.
And on a more direct line, it has been instrumental. The shrimping industry support has been instrumental to the on-site Kemp's Ridley conservation work in Tamaulipas. There's no two ways about it. The Texas Shrimp Association has always been a supportive partner for many years. And it all started with Les Hodgson, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. And now Andrea helps us out a lot. But going back to the index beaches, for example, if it hadn't been for Les's efforts and the shrimping industry of both countries, I may add, it's the Tamaulipas and Texas Shrimp Associations, we were able to build a conservation camp at the second most important nesting beach for the Kemp's Ridley, which is Tepehuajes. That building is still standing. It's still being used by the state government of Tamaulipas. And not only that, but the fact that for many years, talking about the funding and the uphill battle during the snow blizzard that I was talking about earlier, for many years, we were told, that's it, no more funding, by several agencies. I'm not going to name any agencies. I know everybody's fighting all the other agencies in other rooms. Anyway, Les was out there. Mr. Hodgson goes to Washington was what we said for many years. Mr. Hodgson goes to Washington, and if it hadn't been for Les and the shrimping industry backing him up, he was there. This is at the time before emails and everything, and he would just tell me, these are all the numbers. of faxes that you need to send. Okay, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And I remember this, it was back in the early 2000s, maybe, I don't recall what year. We were still using faxes. I spent the whole night sending faxes on behalf of Les. He told me, give me the numbers. So in response to your question of how instrumental, how the shrimping industry's help has been, instrumental, I would say. It still is. It has been for many years. So thank you very much.
I'm Kerry Jelpe with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. I was previously. Hello, testing 1 2. I have a couple comments and an idea maybe. I was struck with Ms. Shaver's presentation, specifically the foraging migration map that she showed, and the time periods at which they're foraging most often, and how that correlates really well with blue crab spawning migrations. And of course, correlation doesn't, mean causation, but the idea that it might be something to look at in terms of, several of y'all mentioned the reduction in hatchlings per nest, that type of thing. So you need the energetics from your prey items. So if there's less prey items, then you would have less hatchlings. So the idea would be to look at abundance of blue crabs in correlation to the number of hatchlings per nest would be a good idea. And a comment specifically also with regards to Ms. Shaver's presentation was the grids where the turtles were seen most often. I did my graduate research work off the coast of Louisiana on these sand shoals that we identified as areas of high abundance for blue crab spawning activity, and they overlap very, very closely with those maps, specifically Ship Shoal and Trinity Shoal. And there are other areas off of Port Arthur, off of Sabine Lake, the Sabine Bank, which hasn't been identified as a blue crab spawning ground, but it's similar habitat. And it seemed like some of those hotspots also overlaid those areas. So,
Thank you for your input on that. I'd love to get your card and we can exchange some information, maybe even collaborate. I am pleased to say there wasn't enough time in my presentation, but our group has also expanded out into captures in the Northern Gulf, and they're going out with Mandy Tumblin from Louisiana, and they're starting to deploy some transmitters on turtles in the foraging grounds. Ship Shoal is one of the areas that they're going out into. And yeah, we'd like to get your read in also where you think some of those hot spots are, and we can provide that information to our colleagues that are out there capturing turtles. And that's really going to help us with knowing that, getting more information about that timing of the remigration, because if the transmitters are put out right in the foraging grounds, hopefully we'll get, we've gotten at least one turtle that after it was put out that first year went down into Mexico. So we can hopefully get some more of those types of tracks. So thank you very much. Make sure I get your card. Thank you.
I agree, and you may have noticed that on one of my threats on the foraging grounds, I had a tractor, a grader, and the reason I had that there was because of the ship shoals being mined and used for beach replenishment. So that's the connection there. And two, after attending the blue crab session yesterday, it became immediately obvious that if we did a workshop, we would have a blue crab sub-modeling group incorporated in it.
For sure.
I'd like to add one more thing to that. Some of you here are old enough to remember Dr. Gordon Gunter, who was the director of the Ocean Springs Lab. He identified an area where those turtles, he was not referring to the turtles, but he identified that area where the turtles forage off of Louisiana as the fertile fisheries crescent. Henry Hildebrand also described the Kemp's Ridley habitat as white shrimp blue crab habitat.
Yeah, and Henry did a survey for Larry Ogren out of NOAA one time, and he identified those platforms from like Searim Park all the way over towards the Mississippi as potential vital habitat for Kemp's Ridleys based on the fact that they were rich in blue crabs, et cetera.
Frank Hernandez, University of Southern Mississippi, and I'll preface this by saying I'm not a sea turtle person, but I think my comment or question follows up on the previous one, in that I think one of the speakers mentioned earlier that there's not been a lot of ecology talk, at least presented today. And so what's the status of including environmental climatic variables in all this noise that you're witnessing, variability in river discharge off this fertile fishery crescent, how does that affect blue crab and all this? There's anomalously high some years incursions of the loop current that come up, and maybe that affects this sort of, larger entrance into the Gulf, maybe more of this immigration. Someone talk about a loss, perhaps frequency of eddy formation that these things may get entrained in. There's lots of other anomalous events and things that could explain some of this variance. We've had these sargassum blooms and outbreaks and things like that, which may be good in some cases. So to what extent has any ecosystem sort of dynamic been incorporated into any of the assessments for turtles? I know it's not being used in fish much outside of grouper, but I don't know, anybody pushing that or exploring that?
In the first assessment workshop, it was pretty hectic, and we discussed some of those issues, but we didn't get to incorporate them. But yes, they are being considered. The high years of high early discharge of the Mississippi River, bringing lethally cold waters into areas where young kips who recruited the fall before might have overwintered, might account for that spring spate of strandings that occurs. So yes, oceanographic variables we will attempt to incorporate more and more realism into an assessment model if we ever get to do another one.
So when
That just reminded me too that I think the Bonnie Carey Spillway, since it's been open, it's opened 12 times, but 4 have been in the last decade. So I mean that's another one of these things that could be mined.
Right, and so when we were, I think in a couple presentations, and talking about moving from just statistical relationships to mechanistic, that's what mechanism is what you're after, how changing environmental conditions drives patterns, and it's on a lot of folks' radar, but in terms of having the time and the manpower to do that, it's personnel time, right? The data's out there. You could do some of these things if you, but it costs money to sit and work on it. And whether that is being prioritized or other aspects of recovery, I don't think, and maybe Brian I'll try to let him chime in on some of this perhaps. In terms of prioritizing recovery, understanding mechanistically how the sea turtle life cycle works, what are the drivers, the environmental drivers that explain trends and variability, is hugely important. And maybe Brian can speak to what's being done from the recovery side to actually have the knowledge to know what to implement to recover the species. Hopefully that's a segue to bring in Brian.
Yeah, thanks for that. One thing I'll say before I pick up that thread, and folks can hear me again, so I'm not just talking to the office. Okay. One thing I wanted to mention, this is a great discussion, really important, something I was thinking about too during the presentations, is that on the good news side of things, this issue of trying to look at environmental covariates as drivers for things like remigration interval, for example. There's a lot of literature already out there on other sea turtle species. So, not only is there a strong research underpinning conceptually, but there's also a lot of potential tools that we can use to develop hypotheses and test those from other species. Of course, we need to adapt those things to be Kemp specific for them to be most relevant. But I was sitting here thinking that there's a potential workshop like Benny's proposing could be a great benefit might be having some folks who've done those kinds of approaches for other species and what to understand the challenges, the assumptions, the pitfalls, et cetera. So that's an important point to keep in mind. On the restoration side, I'll try to keep it relatively simple. I think there are a couple of folks who are even more steeped in the NERDA restoration world than I am. Sarah Wisman from NOAA, I think I see her perhaps online here too, and Dennis Clem. But to summarize, the idea on the restoration side, at least as far as the OPA, Oil Pollution Act regs are concerned, Oil Pollution Act is what describes the NERDA process that we need to follow, is that restoration is supposed to take place in kind and in place, which means for whatever was injured, is to be restored. And so that's to the extent possible, the life stages, and then of course at the numbers. Now, because it's challenging to do restoration specifically for surface pelagic juveniles, as everyone can imagine. There was a lot of discussion, and still is, and this is in the public domain, of course, in restoration plans and such, about getting the highest benefit to the overall populations by identifying specific restoration activities that might have the highest impact in terms of number of animals, and importantly from a population perspective, those that target those older and larger individuals should have the highest benefit numerically, and then also to population recovery. So as you'll see, and I invite everyone to go check out the trustees restoration plan, the strategic framework that was produced by the trustees a year ago. It sort of outlines the goals and the priorities and the conceptual underpinning for why the portfolio of restoration approaches. And so as you can imagine, there are activities that are focused on nesting beach protection, on mitigation of various threats, et cetera, as well as there, of course, will be some monitoring and assessment to go to accompany those projects. And then on the in-water side, activities that also identify and reduce threats to animals in the water. So the idea is to try to have a balanced portfolio approach that doesn't simply focus on a particular component of the population or a particular threat, but rather recognize that as a widely distributed species in the case of Kemp's, and then other sea turtle species as well, that there are lots of different places where restoration can occur and have some benefit to the population that restores for the injury. So hopefully that, hopefully I hit what was being teed up there, but I'm happy to articulate more if needed.
We have I'm not sure we're actually going viral with this, but we do have an online audience. If anyone is out there and listening, if y'all have any questions online, I believe, Joe, I'm not sure if they can actually talk, but they can definitely type their question in to the chat box. Okay. Well, are there any other questions from the audience?
Just a really quick question. My name is Andrea with the Texas Shrimp Association. Statistically, the number or the percentage, is it still roughly about 12%, 10 to 12%, in reference to the bycatch reduction, does it account for about a 10 to 12% loss in shrimp? Is that percentage still fairly accurate? Did I ask that accurately? And I don't know if that's stated on the NOAA website. I know I've read that somewhere, that the loss of shrimp by using bycatch reductions, i.e. the turtle excluder device, is about 12% loss of shrimp, which is about 30,000 a year. I was just curious.
I think for TEDs per se, it's 6%.
6%?
And with TEDs and birds, you're getting into that range.
About 12%? Okay. I was just curious.
I think that's correct, but that's my recollection. I might add that the shrimping amount of shrimping effort has declined tremendously compared to what it was back in the 50s and 60s.
I just have to ask this question. We've thrown blue crabs around for most of the meeting, and I guess my question is, and you get into that 18-meter area that Donna's talking about and that sort of thing. When you say blue crab, are you talking about the greater and the lesser species? Because through the decades of my observations, you're seeing more Calanectes similis than you are Sapetus in those areas. Is the similis playing just as an important role as a food source?
I have not seen a single trend line based on CMAP data of the other swimming crab trends. So I can't answer your question, but it's certainly a good question and should be looked at before we.
I'll assure you it's much more abundant.
But yeah, most of the literature would suggest that Kemps, just like other sea turtles, are pretty opportunistic. So if it's there, they'll eat it. Yeah, if there's an abundance.
I agree. From my gut content study, it's been several years actually since I've done that study, but they did eat a wide range of crabs in Texas, specifically South Texas. It wasn't just the blue crab, although the blue crab is certainly a preferred item if they have the opportunity to get it, but they'd also take the Dolly Varden crabs, the spider crabs, and a variety.
The peas of the female, right?
Are there any questions from anyone else? Okay. Well, again, I appreciate all the speakers, both here in person and also online, for being able to take time out of their busy schedules to come here today and make this symposium a very successful symposium. Thanks to the audience for their attention here. And we will be having, in about 10 minutes, our Lyle Simpson Award luncheon. So everybody is invited to that. But again, I appreciate everybody here, and thanks a lot. Well, one thing.
One last thing. We'll be putting together a kind of a summary symposium for this workshop that will be available online on our websites. That'll be available in the near future.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.